Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we step into a tiny colonial cabin, while endless snowstorms bury the wilderness outside one frozen handful at a time. You stand at the edge of a narrow frontier settlement somewhere deep in colonial America. Probably sometime in the early 1700s. Though honestly, the weather feels old enough to predate human memory entirely. Snow slides across the ground in pale waves beneath a darkening sky. Pine trees sway slowly in the wind like exhausted giants debating whether survival is still worth the effort. The cold reaches your face immediately, sharp and dry enough to sting your lungs with every breath. You already understand one important truth. If you were truly out here without shelter, you probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to share your location and local time down below. Somewhere out there, another listener is probably hearing winter wind outside their own window right now. Now, dim the lights and step carefully through the snow. The settlement barely deserves the name. A few rough cabins stand scattered between pine trees beside a frozen creek. Smoke rises weakly from several chimneys before vanishing into the storm clouds overhead. No taverns, no shops, no cheerful lanterns glowing in windows. Just survival arranged into the shape of a village. Your boots sink deeply into fresh drifts as you follow a narrow packed trail toward the nearest cabin. Snow squeaks beneath each step. Colonial travellers often describe that sound during severe winters. The strange dry squeal frozen snow makes under pressure when temperatures fall brutally low. It is oddly delicate for something capable of killing people. The wind pushes harder now. Not violent yet, just persistent. That feels worse somehow, like the storm has settled in comfortably and intends staying a while. You pull your coat tighter while approaching the cabin. Its walls are built from stacked logs darkened by years of smoke and weather. Frost clings thickly around the tiny windows. Fabric scraps have been stuffed into cracks between the timbers to block drafts. A few chicken feathers swirl through the snow near the doorway, which is either charming frontier realism or evidence something unfortunate happened recently to dinner. The door opens before you knock. Warmth does not exactly rush outward. Colonial warmth rarely rushed anywhere. Instead, a tired breath of smoky air drifts slowly across your face, carrying scents of pine resin, damp wool, ash, stew, and human exhaustion. A woman studies you silently from the doorway. You notice immediately how many layers she wears indoors: thick wool shawl, heavy skirt, knitted cap covering most of her hair. The cabin behind her glows dimly orange from firelight, but clearly the heat reaches only part of the room. People often imagine colonial homes as quaint little spaces from paintings full of rosy cheeks and cheerful candlelight. In reality, winter cabins were frequently cold, smoky, crowded, and permanently damp. Historians continue debating how comfortable these structures truly were because surviving records vary wildly between wealthy settlements and isolated frontier communities like this one. The woman finally nods. Inside. The cabin feels smaller than expected, almost unbelievably small. The ceiling hangs low overhead, crossed by rough beams blackened from years of smoke exposure. A stone hearth crackles weakly along one wall, while iron pots hang above glowing coals. Every surface appears occupied by something necessary for survival. Blankets drying near the fire, boots lined carefully beside the wall, bundles of herbs hanging from rafters, tools stacked near the door, a musket resting within easy reach. A dog lifts its head from beside the hearth and watches you suspiciously without bothering to stand up. Honestly, fair enough. Frontier dogs probably spent half their lives judging strangers while trying not to freeze. Children sit wrapped beneath blankets near the firelight. One little boy rubs sleepy eyes while another pokes gently at embers, using a stick approximately 2 inches too close to disaster. Their father kneels near the hearth, feeding split logs carefully into the flames. Nobody wastes firewood here. That becomes obvious quickly. Every piece enters the fire deliberately, almost respectfully. A widely accepted historical understanding is that gathering enough wood often consumed enormous amounts of colonial winter labour. Families could burn several cords of timber during severe seasons, especially in northern settlements. Entire days vanished into chopping, hauling, stacking, drying, and protecting firewood from snow. Outside, wind rattles against the cabin walls. You hear it slipping through cracks despite the stuffed cloth and mud sealing the gaps. Tiny drafts move constantly across the floor, brushing your boots with icy fingers. The cabin fights winter continuously, never fully winning. The father gestures toward a rough wooden stool beside the hearth. You sit. Immediately one side of your body grows warm while the other remains cold enough to remember the outdoors. That strange half-frozen feeling belonged to daily life for many colonial settlers. Even indoors, winter rarely disappeared completely. The mother stirs something inside an iron pot. Stew, perhaps, or soup, or the frontier version of opening the refrigerator and combining every remaining ingredient while pretending it was always the plan. Steam curls upward, carrying scents of onions and root vegetables. Maybe a little salted meat. Not much, though. Food supplies shrink dangerously during long winters. The children watch the pot carefully without appearing obvious about it. You notice that immediately too. Not greed exactly, awareness. One fascinating but slightly strange historical tidbit involves colonial settlers sometimes heating bricks or stones near fires before wrapping them in cloth and carrying them into bed for warmth. Essentially the historical ancestor of modern heating pads. Except with significantly greater opportunities for accidental burns and midnight panic. The cabin grows darker as evening settles fully outside. Snow taps softly against the windows now. The storm is thickening. Candles flicker weakly on a narrow shelf while shadows stretch across the log walls. Smoke drifts lazily overhead before escaping through the chimney in slow, reluctant streams. You hear occasional popping sounds from damp wood inside the hearth. Nobody speaks much. That silence feels natural here. People exhausted by winter often conserved energy carefully, even conversation. At last the father glances toward the window, storms settling heavy tonight. He mutters quietly. The mother nods once. No surprise, no complaint, just acceptance. Because out here snowstorms are not unusual events. They are seasons within seasons. Long white imprisonments arriving again and again across the wilderness. And as the wind rises steadily beyond the cabin walls, you begin understanding something unsettling. This tiny room, smoky and crowded and barely warm enough, is not simply a home tonight. It is the only fragile barrier between human life and a frozen wilderness, vast enough to erase entire settlements without effort. The fire crackles softly. Outside, snow keeps falling. The storm deepens steadily through the evening until the world beyond the cabin windows disappears completely beneath swirling white darkness. You sit close to the hearth now. Though close is a relative term inside a colonial cabin. Near the fire, your face feels almost hot while your boots remain stubbornly cold. Tiny currents of freezing air slide constantly across the floor through cracks in the logs. The warmth rises upward quickly toward the ceiling beams, leaving the lower half of the room trapped in an entirely different season. The father pushes another split log carefully into the fire using an iron poker blackened from years of use. Sparks drift upward in bright orange spirals before vanishing into smoke. That smoke never fully leaves the cabin. You notice it hanging overhead in thin grey layers beneath the rafters. It stings your eyes faintly. The smell settles into your clothes almost immediately. Pine smoke, damp ash, burned resin. It clings to everything here, including blankets, walls, hair, even the bread cooling beside the hearth. A commonly accepted historical fact is that many colonial homes remained smoky indoors throughout winter because chimneys drafted poorly, especially during storms. Some cabins lacked proper fireplaces entirely in earlier settlements, relying instead on central hearths that filled rooms with enough smoke to slowly preserve both meat and lungs at the same time. The younger child coughs softly beneath his blanket. Nobody reacts much. That feels unsettling until you realise coughing probably formed part of the ordinary soundtrack of winter life. Smoke inhalation, cold air, damp bedding, and crowded sleeping conditions made respiratory illness painfully common. The mother lifts a kettle from the hearth. Steam curls upward, carrying the earthy smell of boiled herbs. Not tea exactly, more like survival disguised as tea. She pours the hot liquid into rough clay cups and hands them around carefully. When yours reaches your hands, the heat feels almost miraculous against your frozen fingers. The drink tastes bitter. Wild mint, perhaps. Something woody underneath. Possibly bark. Frontier cooking often operated under the cheerful philosophy of if it keeps you alive. Technically it counts as cuisine outside. Wind presses hard against the walls. The entire cabin creaks softly in response. You glance upward instinctively at the roof beams. Thick hand-cut timbers stretch across the ceiling, supporting layers of bark, packed earth, and rough shingles now buried beneath growing snow. Historians still debate how effectively many frontier roofs handled extreme snowfall, because surviving cabins varied enormously in craftsmanship. Wealthier settlements sometimes built sturdy insulated homes, while isolated families often improvised with whatever materials they could gather before winter arrived. Improvised feels like the correct word here. The cabin survives through stubbornness more than elegance. You study the windows next. Tiny panes of uneven glass tremble faintly whenever the wind gusts harder outside. Frost has spread across their edges in delicate white patterns resembling fern leaves. Colonial glass remained expensive and difficult to produce. So many poorer cabins used oiled paper or animal skins instead. Honestly, after hearing this wind for 10 minutes, you begin respecting anyone who willingly trusted paper to stand between themselves and January. The dog finally stands and circles twice beside the fire before collapsing heavily onto the floorboards again. One ear twitches each time the wind rises. Animals notice storms differently. The father notices too. You can tell by the way he occasionally glances toward the chimney, listening for changes in the draft. A strange historical tidbit from some colonial settlements claimed that certain dogs could predict blizzards hours before snowfall arrived by refusing food or staring toward forests. Whether this reflected genuine animal behavior, or simply exhausted settlers assigning mystical talents to cold farm dogs, remains unclear. The stew disappears slowly from wooden bowls. Nobody eats quickly. Food and warmth both demand patience here. You notice how carefully every crumb gets scraped from the bowls afterward. Even the children lick spoons clean before handing them back. Winter transforms ordinary meals into calculations. How much flour remains? How much salt pork hangs in storage? How many storms still wait ahead before spring? The father rises and crosses toward the door. Cold air slips immediately into the room when he opens it slightly to check outside. Snow blows inward across the floorboards in tiny glittering bursts. The darkness beyond looks endless. No moon, no stars. Just swirling white illuminated faintly by firelight spilling through the doorway. He closes the door quickly. Drifts will bury the shed by morning, he says quietly. The mother nods without looking up from mending a wool sock beside candlelight. You watch her fingers moving steadily through the fabric. The sock already contains older repairs crossing newer repairs. Colonial clothing rarely disappeared until it physically surrendered to reality altogether. Fabric cost too much. Spinning, weaving, sewing, washing, drying, and repairing garments consumed staggering amounts of labour. One respected historical estimate suggests colonial women spent huge portions of winter producing textiles by hand. Entire evenings vanished beneath candlelight while mending clothing beside fires like this one. The cabin grows quieter as night deepens. The children curl closer beneath blankets near the hearth. One little boy leans sleepily against the dog, who tolerates this arrangement with the emotional resignation of an overworked babysitter. You hear the storm more clearly now. Not just wind, different layers of sound. Snow rattling softly against walls, tree branches scraping outside, occasional groans from the roof overhead, and beneath everything else, the constant breathing crackle of the fire. That fire controls the entire cabin. Every movement revolves around it. Wet gloves hang nearby, drying slowly. Boots line the hearthstones. A kettle simmers continuously above the coals. People shift positions carefully to capture heat while avoiding sparks. Without the fire, the room would become deadly within hours. The father finally lowers himself onto a stool near the hearth with a long, tired sigh. His beard smells faintly of smoke and snowmelt. Deep cracks mark the skin across his knuckles from cold weather and endless labour. Frontier winters age people quickly. You can see it plainly. Not dramatic suffering exactly, just constant wear, the kind that settles slowly into bones. Another gust rattles the cabin hard enough to shake loose tiny bits of dust from the ceiling beams. The younger child stirs uneasily beneath blankets. The mother speaks softly without looking up from her sewing, winds turning north. Nobody answers. They all understand what that means already. Colder air, longer storm, more snow. You settle deeper beside the hearth while flames flicker across the rough log walls. The cabin smells increasingly of damp wool and pine smoke as drying clothes release steam into the warm air. Outside. The storm presses endlessly against the tiny structure, and somewhere beyond those buried trees and frozen drifts stretches hundreds of miles of wilderness, where winter moves silently through the darkness like something ancient and patient. The fire cracks softly again. Someone adds another log. The night continues. The hour grows later. Though inside the cabin, time feels strangely disconnected from ordinary life. No clocks tick here. No street lamps glow outside. The storm erased evening gradually until only darkness remained pressing against the frozen windows. The children have started falling asleep beside the hearth now. One little boy lies wrapped beneath quilts with his head resting against the dog's side. The older child still fights exhaustion bravely, blinking slowly at the fire while trying to remain part of the adult world for a few minutes longer. You understand the feeling. Firelight creates its own kind of gravity during winter. Nobody wants leaving it. The mother folds several heavy blankets near the wall, while the father checks the door latch one final time. Every nighttime ritual here revolves around keeping cold outside where it belongs, or at least mostly outside. A firmly established historical reality is that colonial families often slept together in shared beds, especially during harsh winters. Separate bedrooms remained rare in poorer frontier settlements. Entire households crowded into single heated spaces because maintaining warmth mattered far more than privacy. Modern people sometimes hear this and immediately imagine inconvenience. Colonial settlers heard it and thought, excellent, fewer people freezing before dawn. The father drags a straw mattress closer toward the hearthstones. Dust rises softly from the ticking fabric when he moves it. You catch faint smells of old straw, smoke, damp wool, and something earthy underneath. Probably boots. Everything inside the cabin eventually smells slightly like boots. The mother spreads quilts carefully across the mattress while the children stir sleepily nearby. The blankets appear thick but uneven. Some sections consist of patched wool. Others include scraps from older clothing stitched together over many winters. Nothing here goes unused. You notice that constantly. A cracked spoon still functions. A burned kettle still boils water. A coat with 6 repairs remains a perfectly good coat. One quirky historical account from colonial New England described travellers sharing crowded beds with complete strangers at roadside inns during winter journeys. Personal space apparently became a seasonal luxury people abandoned immediately once temperatures dropped low enough. Honestly, after standing outside earlier, you begin understanding the logic. The father removes his boots near the fire. Steam rises faintly from thick wool socks. His feet must ache terribly after long days moving through snow and frozen mud. Frostbite remained a serious danger during colonial winters, especially for labourers working outdoors continuously. Historians still disagree over how frequently severe frost injuries occurred in isolated settlements, because frontier medical records remain frustratingly incomplete. People simply endured enormous amounts of discomfort without documenting every frozen toe along the way. The older child finally loses his battle with sleep. His head droops sideways. The mother smiles faintly before guiding him gently beneath blankets near the hearth. Nobody gets tucked into separate cozy rooms tonight. Everyone settles together within reach of warmth. You help spread another rough blanket across the mattress. The wool scratches against your hands. Colonial textiles rarely prioritize softness. Survival fabrics tended towards sturdy, itchy, and approximately one emotional step away from carpeting. Outside. The storm keeps moving around the cabin in restless waves. Sometimes the wind rises suddenly and shakes the walls hard enough to rattle dishes on the shelf. Then, for several moments, everything quiets again except for snowfall brushing softly across the roof. Those pauses feel stranger than the noise. The silence afterwards seems too complete. The mother hangs another kettle above the coals before dimming one of the candles. Shadows lengthen immediately across the room. Firelight flickers over rough timber walls blackened by years of smoke. The cabin feels smaller at night. Lower somehow. More enclosed. You begin noticing sounds hidden earlier beneath conversation and movement. The crackling hiss of damp logs. The rustle of straw beneath blankets. Someone breathing heavily already half asleep. The tiny clicking noise frost makes against window glass. And always the wind. A respected historical observation from several colonial diaries noted that winter nights often lasted 14 hours or longer in northern settlements, forcing families indoors for extraordinary stretches of time. Imagine spending nearly every evening for months inside one smoky room with the same few people, while storms buried the outside world. Actually, no need imagining. You're already here. The father finally stretches out near the hearth with a tired groan. The dog immediately steals part of the blanket arrangement by lying directly across everyone's feet. Frontier dogs clearly understood thermodynamics extremely well. The mother remains awake longest. She sits beside the fading candle mending clothing while everyone else settles gradually into sleep around her. Needle flashes through fabric in steady rhythm, in and out, a quiet winter sound. You notice how carefully she conserves candlelight too. Candles cost money and labour. Many colonial families relied on homemade tallow candles that smelled unpleasant while burning and produced dim, smoky light. Beeswax candles worked better, but remained expensive luxuries for wealthier households. This candle smells faintly of animal fat and smoke. Not pleasant exactly. But warm light rarely needs personality. Eventually even the mother lowers her sewing. The cabin darkens further. Only the hearth glows now, casting soft red light across blankets and sleeping faces. You lie down at last. Immediately you understand another truth about colonial sleep. Comfort was negotiable. Warmth was not. The mattress beneath you feels uneven and lumpy. Straw shifts noisily whenever anyone moves. Blankets weigh heavily across your legs but leave tiny cold gaps near your shoulders whenever you turn. And yet, despite everything, exhaustion pulls steadily at your body. Winter labour did that. People slept hard because survival consumed nearly every waking hour. A strange colonial superstition once claimed, sleeping with your head pointed north invited illness during winter, because cold spirits supposedly travelled along northern winds. Scholars still debate whether such beliefs reflected leftover European folklore or simply practical fear of freezing drafts entering poorly insulated homes. Either way, nobody here sleeps near the door tonight. The fire settles lower. Red embers pulse softly within collapsing logs. You hear snow sliding from the roof outside with a muffled rushing sound. For one brief, terrifying moment it resembles footsteps approaching through drifts. The father lifts his head slightly, listens, then relaxes again, even half asleep. People remain alert here. Frontier winters trained settlers never fully trusting nighttime noises. The cabin air grows thicker now from smoke, breathing, damp clothing, and heat trapped beneath the low ceiling. Yet cold still lingers near the floorboards. Your face feels warm beneath blankets while the tip of your nose remains freezing. It is a surprisingly specific kind of discomfort. You understand now why people slept wearing caps indoors. Across the room, one child coughs softly in his sleep. The dog sighs. Wind brushes against the walls again. And slowly, surrounded by flickering embers, crowded blankets, pine smoke, and the endless storm outside, the tiny colonial cabin drifts deeper into night. You wake sometime deep in the night without understanding why at first. The cabin remains almost completely dark except for a dull red glow inside the hearth. Embers pulse softly beneath collapsed logs like tiny breathing creatures buried under ash. Everyone around you still sleeps beneath heavy blankets. Then the wind hits again. The entire cabin groans. You hear it immediately now, not merely outside the walls but everywhere at once, around the roof, beneath the floorboards, through cracks in the timbers. The storm no longer sounds like weather, it sounds alive. A low howl slides across the cabin, followed by sharp, rattling bursts against the windows. Snow taps the roof in restless waves. Somewhere outside, a tree branch creaks slowly beneath heavy ice. You pull the blanket closer around your shoulders. Cold air brushes your face despite the crowded room and glowing embers nearby. The fire has weakened considerably while everyone slept. One side of the cabin feels wrapped in fading warmth, while the corners disappear into shadow and frost. The father stirs beside the hearth. Even half asleep, he noticed the fire dropping. That alone tells you something important about frontier winters. People could never entirely relax. Some part of the mind remained alert all night, listening for danger. A dying fire during severe weather was not inconvenience, it was threat. He pushes himself upright with the exhausted slowness of someone whose body aches permanently from cold weather and labour. The floorboards creak beneath his weight as he kneels near the hearth. Carefully, he lifts a split log from beside the wall and places it onto the embers. For several moments nothing happens, then faint flames return, licking weakly through the ash. The room brightens slightly, enough for you to see frost glittering along the inside edges of the window. One detail frequently noted in colonial journals is how dramatically indoor temperatures dropped overnight once fires burned low. Families often woke repeatedly to feed hearths during severe storms, especially in smaller cabins where heat escaped quickly through roofs and gaps between logs. The father rubs his hands together near the flames before glancing toward the door. Listening. Always listening. You realize the storm has changed since evening. Earlier the wind rose and fell naturally. Now it roars continuously without pause, like standing beside an endless river. The sound begins affecting your thoughts after a while. There is something hypnotic about hearing the same noise hour after hour inside darkness. You understand how isolation changes people during long winters. The younger child whimpers softly in his sleep. The mother wakes immediately, reaching beneath blankets to pull him closer against her side before he fully stirs. Nobody speaks. Voices feel unnecessary at this hour. The cabin exists in a strange half-dream between sleeping and watching the storm. A lesser-known colonial belief claimed that prolonged winter winds carried strange emotional effects. Some settlers insisted endless storms caused irritability, vivid dreams, or melancholy. Whether these accounts reflected superstition or simple exhaustion from isolation remains uncertain. Though honestly, after listening to this wind for several hours, you begin suspecting the storms absolutely enjoy psychological warfare. The fire strengthens slowly. Orange light flickered across hanging herbs near the rafters. Bundles of sage, dried flowers, and roots sway faintly whenever drafts slip through the room. The air smells thicker now. Smoke, ash, damp wool, wet leather drying beside the hearth, and underneath everything else. People. Not unpleasant exactly, just human. Warm breathing in cold darkness. The father finally settles back beneath blankets, though you notice he leaves one arm outside the covers near the hearth, as if prepared to rise again instantly if needed. Sleep returns slowly. The storm prevents silence entirely. At times, wind shrieks hard enough through the trees to resemble distant voices. Then comes the softer brushing sound of drifting snow piling against the outer walls. You remember earlier when the settlement still existed visibly beyond the windows. Now the outside world feels erased. Another documented reality from harsh colonial winters is that storms sometimes isolated settlements for days or even weeks at a time. Snow-buried trails completely. Rivers froze unpredictably. Travellers vanished. Entire communities survived by relying solely on whatever food and fuel already sat inside their homes. No deliveries arriving tomorrow. No quick trip into town. No comforting weather app promising clearer skies by noon. Just snow. The older child begins coughing now. A rough, sleepy cough. The mother lifts her head again instantly. You notice how quickly adults react to illness here. Winter sickness carried real danger inside crowded cabins where cold air, poor ventilation, and smoke irritated lungs constantly. She pours a little water from the kettle still warming near the coals and guides the child gently awake long enough to drink. Then quiet again. The dog suddenly lifts its head, ears forward. For one uneasy moment, everyone freezes. Even the father opens his eyes immediately. The animal stares toward the door while wind howls outside. You wait, listening. But after several seconds, the dog lowers its head once more with a long sigh. Probably nothing. Hopefully nothing. Frontier settlements carried wolves, wandering livestock, lost travellers, and sometimes far worse fears through the darkness beyond cabin walls. Winter sharpened every nighttime sound until imagination happily volunteered the rest. The fire cracks suddenly, sending sparks upward. One lands near the edge of a blanket before the father brushes it away instantly. That tiny movement feels practiced, automatic. You realize how dangerous open hearths truly were inside wooden cabins packed with dry fabric. Straw bedding, and exhausted people sleeping inches away. Fire provided warmth and survival, yet could destroy everything in minutes. Some colonial households reportedly kept buckets of sand or water permanently near hearths during winter, because chimney fires and stray sparks remained terrifyingly common. Hours seem to pass strangely afterward. Perhaps they actually do. Perhaps winter nights simply stretch time apart. You drift in and out of shallow sleep while storms continue hammering the cabin endlessly. Sometimes the wind fades enough you hearing snow sliding from the roof in heavy muffled sheets. Other times the gusts rise so fiercely the walls tremble around you. The room grows colder again near dawn. You notice it first on your face, then your hands. The embers have weakened once more. Outside, the storm still moves through the wilderness without mercy or exhaustion, and somewhere beneath heavy blankets inside this tiny smoky cabin, every sleeping person unconsciously curls a little closer toward the last surviving warmth of the fire. The father rises long before daylight. At first you only hear the movement beneath blankets and the soft creak of floorboards. Then comes the familiar sound of boots being pulled on beside the hearth. Leather stiff from cold weather groans quietly with each tug. The cabin remains dark except for faint orange coals glowing beneath ash. Overnight the fire shrank to a weak pulsing bed of embers barely holding the cold at bay. Frost now covers larger portions of the windows, spreading delicate white patterns across the glass like frozen branches. Outside, wind still moves through the trees, though less violently than before. That alone seems enough to wake everyone cautiously hopeful. The dog lifts its head immediately when the father stands. Frontier dogs apparently possess supernatural awareness regarding outdoor chores. The animal stretches, yawns dramatically, and prepares emotionally for another terrible workday involving snow, cold, and questionable career choices. The mother opens her eyes slightly beneath blankets. Still blowing, she whispers, "Less," the father answers quietly. She nods once and pulls the younger child closer beside her before drifting half asleep again. You sit up slowly beneath heavy quilts. Cold air reaches you immediately. The warmth from shared blankets vanishes shockingly fast once exposed. Colonial mornings taught people an important lesson. Modern central heating has mostly erased from human memory. Rooms do not stay warm simply because you would prefer them to. The father kneels beside the hearth and begins coaxing flames back from the embers using careful handfuls of kindling. Tiny sparks rise through the darkness while smoke curls upward toward the chimney. A practical detail often mentioned in surviving colonial household records is how essential preserving embers overnight became during winter. Starting fires from scratch each morning consumed precious time and effort, especially during storms when dry tinder remained scarce. Eventually flames return, small at first, then stronger. The room brightens gradually in soft orange waves. Children continue sleeping despite the movement around them. Frontier life trained people early to rest through noise, smoke, barking dogs, and howling storms because otherwise nobody would sleep at all between November and March. The father wraps a scarf around his neck before reaching for a heavy wool coat hanging beside the door. Snowmelt has stiffened parts of the fabric overnight. He checks a small iron lantern next, trimming the wick carefully before lighting it from the fire. You notice how deliberate every action feels. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Even preparing to step outside requires planning. One unusual account from colonial frontier settlements described people hanging strips of dried animal bladder near doors during winter to detect wind direction indoors. Apparently they fluttered whenever drafts entered the cabin. Primitive weather forecasting meets deeply unfortunate interior decorating. The father unlatches the door. Cold crashes into the room immediately, not air exactly. More like an invisible wall striking your face. The lantern flame flickers wildly while snow swirls through the opening across the floorboards. Outside remains almost completely dark. The storm clouds have hidden dawn entirely. You follow him carefully into the snow. Instantly your boots sink deep enough, nearly losing balance. Fresh drifts have piled against the cabin walls overnight, some nearly reaching the lower edges of the windows. The settlement looks transformed beneath the layers of untouched white, or buried, possibly both. Snow muffles everything outdoors except the wind. Cabins nearby appear softened and distorted beneath thick drifts. Chimney smoke rises weakly into grey darkness before dissolving. The father hands you a shovel leaning near the doorway. Its wooden handle feels brutally cold through your gloves. Together you begin clearing snow away from the cabin entrance. Each movement sends powder cascading across your boots. Your breath fogs heavily in the freezing air while muscles ache almost immediately from lifting wet drifts. Colonial winters involved endless physical labour even during storms. Snow had to be cleared from doors, pathways, roofs, sheds, wells, and animal pens continuously or entire settlements risk becoming trapped beneath accumulating drifts. The father works silently beside you. Only the sound of shovels scraping frozen ground interrupts the wind. You notice how quickly snow begins refilling cleared areas. That feels discouraging in a very ancient human way. Nature out here never seems impressed by effort, after clearing enough space around the doorway. The father pushes onward toward a half-buried structure behind the cabin, the shed, or what remains visible of it. Snow reaches nearly halfway up the roof now. He digs carefully toward the entrance while the lantern swings beside him, casting dim gold light across drifting snowflakes. Frost clings thickly to his beard. His gloves already appear soaked. At last the shed door groans open. Warm animal breath drifts outward, immediately carrying powerful scents of hay, manure, damp wool, and survival, inside. 2 goats shift nervously in cramped darkness while several chickens huddle together near stacked feed sacks. The father checks them quickly. Animals represented wealth, food, milk, labour, and future survival during colonial winters. Losing livestock could devastate isolated families already balancing close to starvation. Many frontier diaries reveal enormous concern over keeping animals alive during prolonged storms. Settlers frequently brought weaker livestock directly into cabins during severe weather, which probably improved warmth while dramatically worsening indoor fragrance. The father scatters feed carefully. The chickens react with astonishing enthusiasm considering the hour. Chickens apparently remain tiny feathered opportunists regardless of historical period. You help carry fresh hay from stacked bundles deeper inside the shed. Dust rises around you while goats stare with suspicious rectangular pupils suggesting they absolutely judge human competence constantly. Outside again. Dawn slowly begins appearing through the storm clouds. Not bright sunlight, just slightly less darkness. The settlement emerges gradually from grey morning haze. Snowdrifts curve around fences and cabins in smooth frozen waves. Pine trees stand heavily burdened beneath thick white layers, bending branches toward the earth. The father pauses briefly beside the cabin, listening again, always listening. The wind has eased slightly, though snow still falls steadily from low clouds overhead. Could be worse, he mutters. You glance around the buried settlement and honestly admire the optimism. Back inside the cabin, warmth hits your face in soft, smoky waves. The mother already stirs another pot above the revived fire while the children remain tangled beneath blankets near the hearth. The smell of porridge fills the room. Simple food, but hot. Your gloves steam faintly beside the flames as feeling slowly returns to your fingers. Outside. The endless winter continues swallowing the frontier one snowfall at a time. But for another morning at least, the cabin still stands. The fire still burns, and the people inside keep moving through the storm exactly as they did yesterday, and the day before that, and likely every frozen morning long before you arrived. The cabin smells increasingly of wet wool. By midday, the odour settles into everything so completely you almost stop noticing it. Almost. Steam rises constantly from gloves, coats, scarves, and socks hanging near the hearth. Every available peg, chair, and beam now supports some article of damp clothing slowly drying beside the fire. The room feels crowded not only with people, but with layers of winter itself brought indoors piece by piece. Snow melts from boots onto the floorboards in muddy little puddles. The dog avoids them carefully with the expertise of someone who has seen enough frontier nonsense already. You sit near the fire, rubbing warmth back into stiff fingers, while the mother turns a pair of soaked mittens closer toward the heat. One mitten has been repaired so many times, the original fabric barely remains visible beneath patches. A detail commonly observed in colonial households was the sheer importance of wool during winter months. Wool stayed warm even when damp, which mattered enormously in snowy climates, where completely dry clothing often became impossible. Linen froze too easily. Cotton performed poorly in bitter weather. Wool became the trusted old friend nobody particularly liked, but everyone relied upon. The father removes his outer coat slowly near the door. Snow still clings thickly to the shoulders despite the short trip outdoors earlier. He hangs it beside the hearth, where steam immediately begins lifting from the fabric in faint ghostly curls. The cabin grows warmer now compared to dawn. Not comfortable exactly, just less hostile. That distinction feels important. One child sits cross-legged near the fire, rubbing grease carefully into a pair of leather boots. The smell joins the growing collection already floating through the room. Smoke, wet wool, animal fat, pine resin, damp leather, stew simmering slowly above the hearth. Honestly, frontier cabins probably smelled like survival itself. Strong, persistent, slightly alarming. The mother hands you thick wool socks still warm from drying near the flames. Pulling them on feels strangely luxurious despite their rough texture. You understand quickly why people guarded dry clothing so carefully. Cold, damp fabric clings to the skin like punishment. A curious historical note from several early settlements describes colonists sleeping with heated stones wrapped in cloth, placed near their feet to dry boots overnight. Historians remain divided on how widespread the practice truly became, though anyone waking beside frozen boots at dawn probably considered experimenting with literally any idea available. Outside, snow continues falling steadily, though the wind has weakened somewhat. Through the frosted windows you can barely see neighbouring cabins buried deeper along the tree line. Smoke drifts lazily upward from their chimneys into the pale grey afternoon sky. Nobody visits. Travel during storms remained dangerous even between nearby homes. Deep snow concealed hazards beneath drifts, while freezing temperatures punished anyone lingering outdoors too long. So the cabin turns inward instead, toward chores, toward maintenance, toward enduring. The father sits beside the hearth, sharpening a small knife with long, steady movements. Scrape, pause, scrape again. The rhythmic sound blends with crackling firewood and softly boiling stew. You notice his hands closely now, knuckles cracked, nails darkened from work, small scars crossing fingers and wrists. Colonial labour mark the body visibly. A number of preserved frontier accounts mention skin splitting painfully during winter from constant exposure to cold air, lye soap, rough wool, and manual labour. Some settlers rubbed animal fat or beeswax onto their hands to prevent cracking. Primitive moisturiser perhaps, though significantly less marketable by modern skincare standards. The younger child crawls closer toward the fire, carrying a blanket behind him like a tiny, exhausted ghost. He stretches both hands toward the flames while staring sleepily into the embers. Children learned fire safety early here, probably because not learning fire safety produced extremely short educational careers. The mother begins darning another sock beside candlelight, despite the afternoon not yet fading fully into evening. Winter storms darken the cabin early. Shadows already gather beneath the rafters overhead while snow thickens outside. You hear the occasional drip of melting ice from hanging garments landing softly onto the floorboards. Drip, drip, drip. Small sounds dominate winter life indoors. Without crowds or busy streets, people noticed everything. The hiss of wet wood inside the fire, the rustle of blankets, the shifting weight of someone walking across old planks. The storm outside becomes background music after enough hours. Another piece of historical evidence suggests some colonial families owned surprisingly few complete outfits. Especially in poorer frontier regions, clothing required enormous labour to produce by hand, from spinning thread all the way through weaving and sewing finished garments. People patched, reused, altered, and handed down fabrics until they nearly dissolved from existence. You look around the cabin again and realise almost nothing appears new. The table bears knife marks and burns from years of use. Blankets contain stitched repairs crossing older stitched repairs. Even the iron cooking pot hangs, slightly crooked where one side warped from constant heating. Yet everything continues functioning. That mattered more than appearance. The father suddenly glances upward toward the chimney. Smoke has started drifting back slightly into the room. Immediately he rises. The storm must have shifted wind direction again. He opens the door briefly, letting icy air crash through the cabin while adjusting something near the outer chimney stones. Snow blows wildly across the threshold before he shuts the door once more. The smoke clears slowly afterward. One overlooked reality of colonial cabins involved constant adjustment and maintenance. Fires needed tending. Roofs leaked. Chimneys clogged. Doors warped from moisture and cold. Winter survival rarely allowed people sitting peacefully beside perfect fireplaces all evening while sipping cider attractively. Mostly it involved fixing things before they failed catastrophically. The children finally begin growing restless indoors after long hours trapped inside. One starts carving patterns into a scrap of wood, while the other tosses tiny pebbles for the dog, who reacts with visible disappointment every time the object fails, becoming actual food. Outside, the daylight fades further. The windows darken gradually beneath fresh layers of frost and drifting snow. The mother hangs another kettle over the fire. The father adds more wood carefully from the dwindling indoor stack, and the cabin settles deeper into another long winter afternoon wrapped in smoke, damp wool, flickering firelight, and the endless patient labour required simply keeping cold from winning. By evening, the stew pot looks noticeably lower. You notice everyone noticing it too, not openly. Nobody stares directly into the kettle with despair like characters in dramatic films about survival. Instead, there is a quieter awareness inside the cabin now. The father scrapes the bottom carefully while serving supper. The mother measures flour with more attention than before. Even the children eat more slowly tonight. Winter changes the meaning of food. Outside, snow still falls beyond the windows, though the storm has weakened into a steady drifting curtain. The sky remains dark and heavy above the buried settlement. Smoke curls upward from nearby chimneys in thin grey ribbons before dissolving into the cold evening air. Inside the cabin, the fire crackles steadily while shadows sway across the walls. You hold the wooden bowl close between your hands, partly for warmth and partly because everyone else does the same. The stew tastes simple: turnips, onion, a little salted meat cut into tiny pieces. Perhaps beans softened slowly over hours above the hearth. Not much, but hot. And right now, heat itself feels nourishing. Several surviving colonial household inventories reveal how carefully winter food stores were managed. Families relied heavily on salted pork, dried peas, cornmeal, root vegetables, smoked fish, and preserved apples during colder months. Fresh food became scarce quickly once snow-buried fields and travel routes disappeared beneath drifts. The younger child asks quietly if there will be bread tomorrow. The mother answers yes immediately, too quickly perhaps. You glance toward the remaining flour sack near the wall. It does not look particularly full. The father changes the subject by tossing a tiny scrap of meat toward the dog, who catches it with astonishing speed and immediate emotional gratitude. Honestly, that animal may currently be the happiest creature in the entire settlement. The cabin smells richer during supper. Steam rises from bowls while damp clothes continue drying beside the hearth. Melted snow drips softly from hanging boots onto the floorboards. Somewhere inside the walls you hear faint scratching sounds. Mice. Of course, mice. A lesser-known detail about frontier cabins is how frequently settlers shared winter shelter with unwanted tiny roommates. Grain, warmth, crumbs, and stacked firewood attracted mice constantly during cold weather. Some colonial diaries complain about rodents with the exhausted tone of people realizing civilization itself may simply be losing an endless battle against very determined small mammals. The older child notices the scratching too. He taps lightly against the wall. The noise stops instantly, then resumes 30 seconds later. Bold little criminals. The father finally sits beside the hearth with his own bowl balanced carefully on one knee. Firelight flickers across deep lines around his eyes. You realize how tiring winter vigilance becomes after enough weeks. Not dramatic exhaustion, just steady draining effort. Every day requires carrying wood, checking animals, repairing damage, drying clothing, clearing snow, preserving food, maintaining fires, and planning for the next storm before the current one even finishes. The mother tears a small piece of bread in half before giving most of it to the younger child. You suspect parents did that constantly during hard winters. Quiet sacrifices hidden inside ordinary motions. One traveller writing about colonial settlements remarked that frontier families often ate their largest meals earlier in winter, while supplies remained plentiful, gradually reducing portions as the season stretched on. By late winter, many communities depended heavily on whatever preserved food still survived storage. The fire pops sharply beside you. A shower of sparks spirals upward before fading into darkness near the rafters. Smoke drifts lazily overhead, while candlelight glows softly beside the hearth. The room feels strangely peaceful despite the tension underneath everything. That may be the most unsettling part. People adapt, even to hardship, especially to hardship. The mother begins stirring another kettle after supper ends, not food this time, just hot water mixed with herbs, something calming perhaps, or medicinal. In frontier cabins, the line between tea and medicine often became wonderfully unclear. A curious belief circulated through some colonial settlements claiming onion broth could ward off winter sickness if eaten regularly during storms. Whether this actually helped, or simply gave people strong breath capable of frightening illness away, remains uncertain. The father rises and crosses toward the storage corner near the back wall. You watch him counting quietly beneath his breath while checking hanging bundles and small barrels, dried beans, salt, flour. Maybe smoked meat wrapped carefully in cloth. Inventory mattered deeply during long winters. One miscalculation could become catastrophic before spring thaw reopened travel routes. He notices you watching and gives a tired shrug. Storms linger long enough, he mutters. Folks start eating tomorrow before it arrives. That sentence stays with you. Outside, wind brushes softly against the cabin walls. Snow slides occasionally from the roof with muffled rushing sounds. The storm no longer feels violent tonight. Instead, it feels patient, almost comfortable, settling over the wilderness. The children begin growing sleepy soon after supper. Heavy meals and firelight pull at their eyelids. The younger boy curls beneath blankets beside the hearth while holding a wooden toy horse missing one leg. Still loved though, still useful. Much like everything else here. You notice the mother quietly saving leftover broth inside a covered pot near the fire rather than discarding anything. Not a spoonful wasted. Historical records from harsher colonial winters occasionally describe settlers stretching meals with whatever ingredients remained available. Acorns, chestnuts, wild onions, dried pumpkin. Even tree bark flour appeared in desperate circumstances. Survival cuisine operated under broad creative freedoms. The father feeds another log carefully into the fire. His movements remain slow and economical. Nobody here burns unnecessary energy. You realize winter changes how people move too. Every task becomes deliberate because calories matter, warmth matters, time matters. The cabin darkens gradually as evening deepens outside. Candle flames flicker against the windows where frost has spread almost completely across the glass. Beyond them lies only darkness and falling snow. The mother wraps blankets tighter around the sleeping children. The dog sighs heavily near the hearth, and somewhere deep inside the tiny smoky cabin, beneath the ordinary sounds of spoons scraping bowls and firewood settling into ash, lives the constant silent calculation of how much winter still remains. The stories begin after supper. That seems inevitable somehow. Winter evenings inside small cabins leave people with only a few choices once chores end. Sleep immediately, sit silently for hours listening to wind, or talk. Most people choose talk. The father shifts another log into the fire, while the mother finishes washing bowls with hot water from the kettle. The children lie wrapped beneath blankets near the hearth, pretending very badly to be asleep. You recognize the performance instantly. Frontier children probably mastered fake sleeping before learning proper handwriting. The candle beside the wall flickers softly while shadows move across the cabin ceiling. Outside, snow continues drifting past the frosted windows beneath a moon hidden somewhere beyond heavy clouds. The older child finally asks the question. Tell one. The father grunts quietly. Storm's loud enough already. But the mother smiles faintly. Then tell a quieter one. You notice everyone settling slightly closer toward the fire. There is comfort in shared stories during winter, not merely entertainment, something older than that. Human voices pushing back against darkness. Across many colonial settlements, storytelling remained a central part of winter evenings, especially in isolated homes where printed books were rare and candles too precious for wasteful reading. Families passed time through folk tales, Bible stories, hunting accounts, songs, riddles, and rumours carried from settlement to settlement. The father finally leans back against the wall. When I was young. He begins slowly. A trader came through during winter claiming he saw lights moving through the woods north of Albany. The younger child immediately peeks above his blanket despite supposedly sleeping moments earlier. The father notices, continues anyway. He swore they moved between the trees during storms. Blue lights, not lanterns neither. Said folk followed them sometimes, the child whispers. What were they? The father shrugs. Frozen fools afterward mostly. The mother laughs softly beneath her breath. You do too. Yet outside the cabin the wind brushes against the walls in long whispering gusts, and suddenly the wilderness feels much larger again. A strange but genuine piece of colonial folklore involved mysterious ghost lights appearing near swamps, forests, and snowy trails. Some settlers believed wandering spirits carried lanterns searching for lost travellers. Others blame marsh gases or reflections across snowfields. Either explanation sounds unsettling when surrounded by endless dark trees. The father pokes thoughtfully at the fire. Orange sparks spiral upward. One fellow said the lights belonged to dead hunters, he adds. Men froze in storms and never found home again. The younger child pulls blankets slightly higher. Reasonable decision, honestly. The mother eventually tells her own story next. Softer, less frightening. She describes winters from childhood farther south, where rivers froze only near the edges and snow rarely reached cabin windows. The children listen with fascination usually reserved for fairy tales involving dragons or kingdoms made entirely from pie. To them, mild winters sound mythical. You realize something important then. Children growing up on the frontier accepted conditions adults still secretly feared. Cold cabins, long storms, food shortages, isolation, all ordinary. One surviving diary from a colonial teenager described winter evenings as both comforting and frightening, because stories beside the fire made distant wilderness feel emotionally closer. Listening tonight, you understand exactly what she meant. The cabin shrinks around the firelight while imagination expands everything outside. The father eventually mentions another tale involving a traveller trapped overnight in deep snow who supposedly survived by sleeping inside a hollow tree trunk beside his horse. The mother immediately interrupts. That story changes every winter. still happened. Last year you said it was 3 horses. The father considers this. Cold kills memory first. Even the children laugh quietly. The fire settles lower while conversation drifts gradually from ghost stories towards stranger superstitions. Signs of harsh weather, omens before storms, animals behaving oddly during certain moons. A curious belief recorded in several frontier regions claimed that hearing trees crack sharply at night meant colder weather approached. Settlers often listened carefully to frozen forests because shifting temperatures caused trunks and branches to split loudly in severe cold. The older child asks whether wolves come closer during storms. The father nods once. Sometimes. Have you seen them tracks? That answer feels enough. Nobody asks further questions. Outside. The wind rises briefly and brushes snow against the cabin walls in soft rushing waves. The dog lifts its head from beside the hearth, listening carefully before relaxing again. You notice how every sound still matters here, even during stories, even during laughter. Part of everyone remains alert. The mother begins braiding the younger child's hair absent-mindedly while speaking about a woman she once knew who supposedly predicted storms by watching smoke from chimneys. Smoke bends low before heavy snow, she says. The father snorts quietly. Smoke bends low when wind bends smoke low. She ignores him completely. You suspect this conversation has occurred before, probably many times. A handful of researchers examining colonial folk traditions have noted how weather lore became deeply woven into frontier culture. Without modern forecasting, settlers relied on patterns, observations, animal behavior, cloud shapes, and inherited superstitions to anticipate dangerous storms. Some signs worked surprisingly well. Others probably functioned about as accurately as asking nervous chickens for strategic advice. The older child eventually drifts asleep mid-conversation beneath blankets near the fire. His breathing deepens gradually while adults continue speaking more quietly overhead. The candle burns lower now. Wax pools unevenly beside the holder. Shadows lengthen across rough log walls darkened by smoke and time. The father grows quieter too. Winter evenings seem to drain words slowly from people. Eventually everyone simply listens to the fire for a while, crackling wood, wind outside. Soft breathing from sleeping children. The mother reaches toward the kettle and pours one final cup of steaming herbs into the father's hands. He nods his thanks silently. No dramatic speeches. No grand frontier declarations about courage against nature. Just tired people surviving another snowy evening together inside one tiny cabin. And somehow that feels far more real. The firelight flickers warmly across blankets and rough timber walls while stories settle gradually into silence. Outside, the wilderness remains buried beneath darkness and drifting snow. But inside the cabin, for a few quiet hours at least, human voices have made winter seem smaller. The children fall asleep one by one beside the hearth. Not dramatically. Just gradually surrendering to warmth and exhaustion while the fire crackles softly nearby. The younger boy curls beneath layers of patched blankets, clutching the broken wooden horse against his chest. The older child lies on his back staring upward for a while at the smoke-darkened ceiling beams, before his eyes finally close too. You notice how small they look near the fire, tiny shapes wrapped in wool and candlelight. Outside, the storm still drifts steadily across the buried settlement, but inside the cabin the world narrows towards softer sounds now. Slow breathing, shifting blankets, the occasional hiss from damp wood inside the hearth. The mother kneels quietly beside the sleeping children and adjusts blankets around their shoulders. Her hands move automatically, checking warmth the way some people check locked doors before bed. Parents during colonial winters carried constant fear regarding childhood illness. Cold weather alone rarely caused disease, but crowded cabins, poor nutrition, smoke-filled air, and limited medical knowledge created dangerous conditions once sickness entered a household. The younger child coughs lightly in his sleep. The mother pauses instantly. You see her listening, counting perhaps, waiting for another cough, when none comes immediately. She relaxes slightly and tucks the blanket more tightly around him. The father notices too, though he pretends not to. Instead, he stares into the fire while slowly sharpening a wooden handle with his knife. Tiny curls of pale wood fall onto the floorboards beside his boots. One observation frequently appearing in frontier accounts involves how carefully families monitored children during winter nights. Fevers could worsen quickly in isolated settlements where doctors remained days away through snow-covered wilderness. The cabin air feels thick tonight. Smoke hangs low beneath the rafters because the storm keeps pushing cold air downward through the chimney. You smell pine resin burning in the hearth along with damp wool drying near the flames. And underneath everything, the faint, sharp scent of sickness beginning somewhere in the room. Maybe you only imagine it. Maybe not. The mother eventually rises and hangs fresh herbs above the kettle, simmering near the fire. Steam carries the smell slowly through the cabin. Mint, possibly sage, something bitter underneath. A curious remedy from some colonial households involved placing sliced onions near sickbeds during winter illness, because people believed onions absorbed disease from the air. Whether this practice helped medically, or simply guaranteed everyone smelled aggressively prepared for soup, remains uncertain. The father finally sets aside the knife. Boy's been coughing more, he says quietly. The mother nods without answering immediately. Smoke's worse tonight. Cold too. Silence settles between them for a moment. You realise frontier conversations about illness rarely included easy reassurance because people understood risks too clearly already. The fire burns lower again. The father adds another log carefully while sparks whirl upward through the darkness. The dog opens one eye briefly before deciding none of this requires actual involvement. Reasonable. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders while cold air brushes the back of your neck from somewhere behind the wall. No matter how much heat gathers near the hearth, tiny draughts continue slipping through the cabin endlessly. Winter never fully stays outside. A passage from an early New England diary described parents sleeping lightly all season, because children frequently kicked blankets aside during the night. Reading those words in a warm modern room feels mildly charming. Sitting here beside this fire while cold creeps across the floorboards, it suddenly sounds terrifying. The younger child coughs again, longer this time. The mother kneels beside him immediately and rests a hand gently against his forehead. The father watches without speaking. You watch too. The cabin feels quieter afterward. Even the storm outside seems farther away for several moments. Finally, she exhales softly. No fever yet. Yet. That word lingers. She pours warm herb water into a small cup and carefully wakes the child enough for him to drink. His eyes barely open before closing again almost instantly beneath blankets. Children adapted strangely well to exhaustion during frontier winters. Days involved chores, cold weather, smoky air, and interrupted sleep from storms or fire tending. Rest became less a schedule and more an ongoing negotiation with survival. The mother settles back beside the hearth afterward. Though you notice she no longer returns fully to her sewing, her attention remains fixed quietly on the sleeping boy. The father reaches toward the kettle next. "Remember Amos Fletcher's youngest?" he asks quietly. The mother nods once. Winter before last. Neither says more. They do not need to. You suspect many frontier families carried similar memories. Small graves beside frozen churches. Children lost during fever seasons. Harsh winters remembered not by storms alone, but by absences afterward. Researchers studying colonial burial records have noted unusually high child mortality during severe winters in certain settlements. Illness spread rapidly through crowded homes where ventilation remained poor and medical treatments limited mostly to herbal remedies. Prayer, bleeding practices, or hopeful optimism, honestly. Hopeful optimism may have been the least dangerous option available. Outside, wind brushes snow softly against the cabin walls. The sound resembles waves reaching a shoreline far away. The father eventually lowers himself beside the fire with a tired sigh. "You sleep," the mother murmurs. "I am." You're staring at the chimney, still sleeping. She smiles faintly despite herself. Even now, little fragments of humour survive inside the cabin. Perhaps they have to. The candle burns lower beside the wall, casting long golden shadows across hanging blankets and rough timber beams. Frost thickens again along the windows as temperatures drop deeper into night. The older child shifts beneath blankets and murmurs something unintelligible in sleep, dreaming perhaps of spring fields, or warm bread, or a world where snow eventually stops falling forever. The mother finally leans back against the wall near the hearth, though her eyes remain half open watching the children. Firelight flickers gently across tired faces throughout the room, and somewhere beyond the tiny cabin, beneath endless forests and drifting snow, winter continues moving silently through the darkness while the people inside guard their fragile warmth and one another as carefully as the last surviving embers in the fire. Morning arrives grey and slow. The storm has weakened overnight, but the sky outside still hangs heavy with snow clouds pressing low above the settlement. Frost covers nearly the entire window now except for a small melted patch near the hearth where faint daylight slips through. The younger child wakes coughing. Not the soft, sleepy cough from earlier. This one sounds deeper, rougher. The mother notices instantly. You see concern pass quietly across her face before she smooths it away again. Frontier parents learned quickly that panic accomplished very little during winter. The father rises from beside the fire and kneels near the boy, while the dog watches with unusual stillness from the hearthstones. "Head hurt?" the mother asks gently. The child nods weakly beneath blankets. She presses the back of her hand against his forehead again. Warmer now. Not dangerously so, perhaps, but enough. A number of colonial settlements faced recurring winter illness outbreaks due to crowded homes, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and limited medical treatment. Respiratory infections spread especially easily inside cabins where families spent long stretches together breathing smoky air beside enclosed fires. The cabin suddenly feels smaller than ever. Every cough changes the atmosphere. The mother moves quickly but calmly, more water into the kettle, fresh herbs from hanging bundles overhead, extra blankets near the fire. She opens the pot lid briefly to stir simmering broth while the father checks the woodpile near the wall with a thoughtful frown. Illness means longer fires, more water, more watchfulness. Outside, snow slides softly from the roof with muffled thumps. The settlement remains buried in pale silence beyond the windows. The younger child curls tighter beneath blankets while the mother mixes crushed herbs into steaming water, using a wooden spoon darkened from years of cooking. A fascinating little detail from several colonial medical guides involve people carrying dried herbs inside cloth pouches around the neck during sickness seasons. Lavender, rosemary, garlic, and mint were thought to protect against foul air and disease. Some remedies probably offered comfort. Others mostly ensured everyone smelled aggressively botanical. The mother lifts the steaming cup carefully toward the boy. Drink. He makes a face immediately after tasting it. Honestly, that reaction alone suggests it was probably considered excellent medicine. The father steps outside briefly despite the cold. When the door opens, freezing air sweeps across the floorboards carrying fresh scents of snow and pine into the smoky cabin. You hear the crunch of boots outside, then chopping. Wood again, always wood. The mother settles beside the child while stroking his hair gently away from his forehead. The older boy watches silently from near the hearth, unusually quiet this morning. Children understood illness differently during these winters, not abstractly, personally. They had seen fevers before. The cabin smells increasingly medicinal now. Bitter herbs simmer beside smoke and damp wool. Steam gathers faintly along the colder corners of the windows. The younger child coughs again. The mother listens carefully afterward, counting breaths perhaps. An observation made by several historians studying colonial household life is that women frequently acted as primary medical caretakers in frontier settlements. Most families relied heavily on inherited herbal knowledge, home remedies, religious faith, and practical nursing rather than trained physicians, who often lived many miles away. And during storms like these, even reaching a doctor might become impossible. The father returns carrying fresh split logs dusted with snow. His beard glitters white from frost while cold air trails behind him into the room. How is he warm? That single word carries enormous weight. The father nods slowly and feeds more wood into the fire. No dramatic conversation follows, no hopeful speeches, just quiet preparation. You notice they move more softly now too, bowls placed carefully onto the table, voices lowered automatically. Even the older child stops fidgeting near the hearth. The cabin itself seems to recognize sickness. One unusual colonial remedy recommended placing heated onions against the feet during fever, because warmth supposedly drew illness downward from the body. Medical scholars today remain uncertain whether people genuinely believed this worked, or simply preferred doing something rather than helplessly waiting beside sick beds. The younger child eventually drifts back into restless sleep near the fire. His cheeks remain flushed beneath the flickering orange light. The mother does not move far afterward. She sits beside him mending clothing mechanically while glancing toward him every few moments. Needle through cloth. Glance toward the child. Repeat. Outside. The snowfall finally begins easing. For the first time in days you can see farther across the settlement through the windows. Snowdrifts curve between cabins like frozen waves. Smoke rises from chimneys into pale morning air. One distant figure moves slowly along a buried pathway, carrying firewood across bent shoulders. Life continues, even during sickness. Especially during sickness, perhaps. The father begins repairing a cracked bucket handle near the door while speaking quietly about weather conditions and supply routes. You realize frontier families often balance ordinary survival work alongside fear and exhaustion, because winter allowed no pauses. Animals still needed feeding, water still needed hauling, wood still needed cutting. Cold remained patiently waiting outside regardless of human worries. The older child eventually creeps closer beside his younger brother and places the wooden horse gently near the blankets. No words, just the toy. That somehow feels sadder. The mother notices too. For several seconds her sewing stops entirely, then resumes. A surviving account from a colonial minister once described winter cabins as places where joy and fear often sat side by side beside the same fire. Listening to the quiet room now, you understand exactly what he meant. The hearth crackles steadily. Steam curls upward from simmering broth. Snowmelt drips from the roof outside beneath weak daylight, and inside the tiny cabin, every adult listens unconsciously for the next cough while pretending everything remains ordinary. Because, in frontier winters, people learned an uncomfortable truth very early. Sometimes calm itself became part of survival. The roof begins groaning shortly after nightfall. At first the sound blends naturally with the ordinary noises of winter. Wind brushing the walls, firewood settling in the hearth, snow sliding softly outside. Then comes a deeper creak overhead. Long, heavy, wrong. The father looks upward immediately. Everyone else does too. For several seconds the cabin falls completely silent, except for the fire crackling near the hearth. Another groan follows, this time louder. The roof beams shift with a slow straining sound beneath the weight of accumulated snow. The older child whispers, "Is it breaking?" "No," the father answers quickly. But he already stands. That tells you enough. Throughout colonial settlements, heavy snow posed serious danger to cabins, sheds, and barns, especially structures built quickly or maintained with limited materials. Wet snow became extraordinarily heavy once storms layered repeatedly over existing drifts. The father grabs his coat near the door while the mother immediately begins gathering blankets away from the center of the room, beneath the worst-sounding section of roof. Practical, fast, nobody panics, which somehow makes the situation feel more serious. You help move stools and bedding aside while another deep creaking noise echoes overhead. Tiny bits of dust drift downward from the ceiling beams into the firelight. The younger child wakes coughing and confused beneath blankets near the hearth. "What's happening? Roof's complaining," mother says calmly. An impressive understatement, honestly. The father pulls on gloves still slightly damp from earlier work. He grabs a wooden-handled shovel near the doorway along with a long pole used for clearing snow from the roof edges. Outside. Wind rattles the walls again. The storm itself may have weakened, but several days of snowfall now sit piled across every structure in the settlement. A handful of colonial accounts describe people waking during winter nights to shovel rooftops by lantern light because accumulated snow threatened to collapse. Barns proved especially vulnerable, sometimes trapping livestock beneath falling beams during severe winters. The father opens the door. Cold crashes inward instantly, carrying swirling snow and sharp, pine-scented air into the cabin. The lantern flame flickers wildly beside him. "I'll help," you say. He nods once. Outside. The world glows pale beneath moonlight, finally breaking weakly through thinning clouds. Snow drifts around the cabin in smooth silver curves, while frost sparkles across buried fences and tree branches. The air feels brutally cold now that the wind has eased. Stillness after storms often brings lower temperatures. Your boots sink deeply while circling toward the side of the cabin, looking upward. You finally understand the problem clearly. Snow blankets the roof in enormous, uneven layers. Some sections sag visibly beneath the weight. The father climbs carefully onto a lower side ledge while using the long pole to shove heavy snow downward in thick, crashing sheets. Each avalanche lands around the cabin with muffled thumps that shake the ground beneath your boots. You begin shoveling fallen piles away from the walls immediately before they freeze solid again. Cold air burns your lungs, your gloves stiffen quickly with frost, and overhead the roof creaks every time the father shifts weight across buried beams. A curious note from one frontier settlement mentioned families occasionally hanging strings inside cabins to detect roof sagging during storms. If the string suddenly loosened, people knew snow weight above had begun bending the structure dangerously. Primitive engineering, perhaps. Terrifying engineering, certainly. The father works methodically despite the cold. Push, crash, shovel, repeat. Lantern light swings across drifting snowflakes while your breath clouds heavily in the freezing darkness. The settlement around you remains mostly silent except for distant chopping sounds from another cabin farther downhill. Others heard roof beams complaining too, inside the cabin. Warm firelight glows faintly through frost-coated windows. You glimpse the mother moving near the hearth while the children watch anxiously from beneath blankets. The roof groans again overhead. Closer this time, the father freezes instantly. You do too. For one terrible moment nobody moves. Then comes the sound of packed snow sliding violently downward off the far side of the roof in a massive rushing wave. The father exhales slowly. "Good," he mutters. Apparently terrifying structural noises count as encouragement now. One winter letter written by a colonial farmer described snow removal as digging against the sky itself. Standing here beneath endless drifts while freezing wind cuts through your coat. The description feels surprisingly accurate. Eventually, the worst sections of roof stand mostly cleared. Fresh moonlight reflects off exposed shingles where snow had buried them moments earlier. The father climbs down stiffly from the side ledge. Ice crystals cling thickly to his beard and eyebrows now. His gloves appear nearly frozen solid. Inside the cabin, again. Warmth hits painfully at first. Fingers sting sharply while thawing near the fire. Meltwater drips immediately from coats onto the floorboards. The mother hands steaming broth toward both of you without wasting words. The younger child still lies beneath blankets near the hearth, cheeks flushed faintly from fever and firelight. His coughing seems quieter now at least. The older child asks immediately, "Did it break?" "Not tonight." The father answers, "Not tonight." Another sentence carrying more weight than it first appears. The cabin smells strongly now of wet leather, melting snow, smoke, and overheated wool. Steam rises everywhere as frozen clothing begins thawing beside the fire. Outside, moonlight shines across the buried settlement for the first time since the storms began. The silence feels strange after days of wind, almost unnatural. The father finally lowers himself heavily onto the stool near the hearth. His shoulders sag with exhaustion while he stares into the flames without speaking. You realize winter survival required endless maintenance, not because people lacked skill, but because nature simply never stopped applying pressure. Roofs sagged, fires weakened, food dwindled, bodies grew sick, and every repaired problem waited patiently to return tomorrow in another form. The mother adjusts blankets around the sleeping children once more while frost slowly melts from the windows near the revived fire. Outside, snow gleams softly beneath cold moonlight. Inside the cabin, tired people settle carefully, back beneath blankets while the roof above them creaks only occasionally now, holding itself together for at least one more winter night. The knock comes just after sunset, not loud. Just 3 dull thumps against the cabin door buried beneath layers of frost and packed snow. Everyone freezes immediately. The father lifts his head from beside the hearth, while the dog erupts into sharp barking loud enough startling even itself. The older child sits upright beneath blankets. The mother instinctively pulls the younger feverish boy closer against her side. Another knock follows. Weaker this time, the father reaches automatically for the musket resting near the wall before moving toward the door. You realize how dangerous unexpected visitors could feel during winter on the frontier. Travelers brought news, trade, and companionship. They could also bring sickness, desperation, or trouble following close behind through the snow. A number of colonial travel journals describe winter journeys between settlements as exhausting and deeply hazardous. Snow-buried roads entirely. Rivers froze unpredictably, and travellers frequently depended upon strangers for shelter before darkness or storms became deadly. The father unlatches the door cautiously. Cold air rushes inward, carrying loose snowflakes into the room. Outside stands a man nearly buried beneath frost, and behind him, another figure wrapped heavily in blankets atop a small exhausted horse. For several seconds nobody speaks. The traveller finally removes a scarf stiff with ice from around his mouth. "Road vanished south of the creek," he says hoarsely. "Need shelter till morning." The father studies him carefully, then steps aside. No dramatic hesitation. Just quiet frontier practicality. Refusing shelter during winter storms could become a death sentence. The travellers enter slowly while snow falls from their coats onto the floorboards in glittering piles. The horse remains tied outside near the shed where the father quickly leads it before returning inside moments later covered in fresh frost. The newcomers look exhausted. Not theatrical exhaustion either, the real kind. Grey faces, cracked lips, hands trembling slightly while thawing beside the fire. The second traveller turns out to be a woman older than you first expected beneath all the blankets. She lowers herself carefully onto a stool near the hearth. while the mother immediately hands over steaming broth without asking questions first. Hospitality often functioned differently in frontier settlements. Visitors were not always welcomed warmly, but shelter and hot food during winter emergencies frequently became unspoken obligations between isolated communities. The younger child wakes coughing again from the noise and movement. The woman glances toward him immediately with quiet concern before warming stiff hands near the fire. The cabin suddenly feels impossibly crowded. Wet coats hang beside already drying clothes. Additional boots line the hearthstones. Steam rises everywhere while snowmelt spreads across the floorboards. And yet, strangely, the room also feels more alive than before. The male traveller finally introduces himself between slow, careful bites of stew. Elias, the woman beside him, nods faintly. My sister Ruth. The father gives his own name quietly in return. No lengthy introductions follow. People out here seem to trust actions more than conversation. A peculiar frontier custom recorded in several settlements involved travellers sleeping with boots beneath blankets during severe winter visits, because frozen leather became nearly impossible to pull on quickly by morning. Imagine waking before dawn and discovering your shoes transformed into wooden punishment devices. Honestly, the logic seems sound. The fire crackles steadily while Elias describes conditions farther south. More storms moving eastward. River crossings nearly impossible now. One settlement reportedly lost half its livestock after heavy snow collapsed a barn roof 2 nights earlier. The father nods grimly. We near lost ours yesterday. The conversation drifts slowly after that through weather, supplies, and scattered rumours carried across buried trails. Someone mentions wolves spotted near frozen creek beds. Another traveller supposedly vanished west of the ridge. A mill farther north stopped grinding after floodwater froze the wheel solid. Winter news rarely sounds cheerful. Still, news itself feels valuable. The mother quietly prepares extra bedding near the hearth while Ruth removes layers of scarves and shawls stiff with ice. Her face appears pale from cold and exhaustion. One hand stays wrapped tightly beneath cloth bandages. The mother notices immediately. Frostbite, Ruth nods once. Caught the fingers during the second storm. You glimpse the damaged hand briefly while she adjusts the wrapping. The skin looks angry and swollen even in dim firelight. Medical writings from colonial America often recommended rubbing frostbitten skin with snow or cold water, rather than sudden heat, since rapid warming could worsen tissue damage. Some treatments worked reasonably well. Others belonged firmly inside the historical category, titled People Were Trying Their Best Under Terrible Circumstances. The older child watches the visitors with open fascination from beneath blankets. New people during winter probably felt more exciting than travelling theatre. Elias eventually notices the boy staring. You ever seen a river freeze while moving? He asks. The child shakes his head. Looks alive still beneath the ice, Elias says quietly, like the water's trying to escape. The room falls silent briefly afterward while everyone imagines it. Outside, snow begins falling harder again. You hear wind brushing against the walls in slow, steady waves. The younger child coughs once more beside the hearth. Ruth glances toward him and reaches slowly into a small cloth bag hanging from her belt. Without ceremony, she hands the mother several dried roots bundled carefully together. Willow bark, she says, helped my youngest once. The mother accepts them softly. Moments like this probably happened often across isolated settlements. Medicine, recipes, weather knowledge, tools, and survival tricks passed person to person through quiet exchanges beside winter fires. The cabin grows warmer from so many bodies gathered inside. Candlelight flickers across tired faces while steam curls upward from drying clothes overhead. Outside, the wilderness remains buried beneath endless snowdrifts and dark forests. But inside the tiny cabin tonight there are more voices, more breathing, more life. Even the dog eventually relaxes enough to sleep again near the hearth, though not before giving the newcomers one final suspicious stare, clearly communicating Frontier security policies remain extremely strict. The father adds another log to the fire. Ruth wraps blankets tighter around herself, and somewhere deep in the frozen colonial night, 2 lost travellers have found temporary shelter against the storm inside one overcrowded smoky room glowing softly with firelight. The coldest night arrives without warning. That may be the cruelest part of frontier winters. Storms announce themselves dramatically with wind and snow and dark skies rolling across the wilderness. Extreme cold arrives quietly instead. You notice it first near midnight. The fire still burns. Blankets still cover everyone. Yet something has changed inside the cabin. The air feels sharper somehow, thinner. You wake with your face painfully cold despite sleeping close beside the hearth. Frost now stretches completely across the windows in thick white layers. Even the edges of hanging blankets feel stiff from freezing moisture. The fire has weakened again. Only a few glowing logs remain beneath collapsing ash. Across the room, Elias stirs beneath borrowed blankets and pulls his coat tighter around himself without fully waking. Then the younger child begins coughing hard enough to wake everyone else. The mother sits upright instantly beside him. The father reaches toward the hearth almost at the same moment. No one even asks the question aloud. The room is getting dangerously cold. Periods of severe cold following snowstorms were especially feared in colonial settlements, because heavy cloud cover sometimes trapped relative warmth during active storms. Once skies cleared afterward, temperatures could plunge dramatically overnight. The father feeds more wood into the fire quickly, but the fresh logs struggle catching flame. The chimney draft has changed again in the frozen air. Smoke swirls briefly back into the room before rising upward. The younger child coughs harder beneath blankets. His breathing sounds rough now. The mother lifts him gently closer toward the hearth while wrapping another quilt around his shoulders. Firelight flickers across worried faces throughout the cramped cabin. Nobody fully hides concern anymore. Outside, the world has gone silent. No wind, no snowfall, nothing. Only deep, frozen stillness pressing against the walls. A few colonial journals describe nights so cold that trees split apart in the forest with explosive cracking sounds. Settlers lying awake inside cabins sometimes heard these distant bursts echoing through frozen valleys after midnight, as if winter itself were breaking apart slowly in the dark. The older child whispers, "I'm cold, so am I." Elias mutters from beneath blankets. Oddly comforting somehow. At least misery remains communal. The father kneels beside the hearth, working furiously now. Small pieces of kindling finally ignite beneath the larger logs. Flames begin spreading slowly across blackened wood, while sparks drift upward. You hold your hands toward the heat immediately, even from this close. Warmth struggles reaching far into the cabin tonight. The cold seems heavier than usual. More determined, Ruth quietly unwraps her bandaged hand near the fire and winces. Frostbite apparently throbs worse during severe cold. She flexes swollen fingers carefully while staring into the flames with exhausted eyes. A particularly strange practice from some northern settlements involved people sleeping with hot potatoes wrapped in cloth at the foot of beds during brutal winter nights. Practical, perhaps, though also creating the faint possibility of waking up beside emergency breakfast. The mother mixes willow bark into steaming water again while the younger child leans weakly against her shoulder. His cheeks glow red from fever now. The father notices too. He says nothing for several moments, then quietly asks Ruth. "Your youngest recover?" Ruth hesitates. Not long, just enough. "Yes," she answers finally. But something inside the room changes anyway. You hear it in the silence afterward. The fire strengthens gradually. Though the cabin still feels painfully cold near the walls, Frost has begun creeping along lower sections of the timbers themselves now, tracing pale crystals between cracks stuffed with old cloth. One historical observation made by travellers in frontier regions noted that water buckets sometimes froze indoors overnight, even with fires burning continuously. Smaller cabins trapped warmth more effectively than larger homes, but extreme cold still found ways entering through roofs, floors, windows and doors. The dog whines softly near the hearth before crawling directly against the children beneath blankets. Nobody objects. At this point the dog may officially count as heating equipment. The father eventually rises and crosses toward the door. The mother looks up sharply. "Where, Woodpile? You just filled the rack. It won't last till dawn." He wraps a scarf around his face before stepping outside, the moment the door opens. The cold entering the cabin feels almost physical. Not air, force. You hear the older child gasp softly while frost swirls briefly across the floorboards like white dust. Then the door slams shut again. The room feels impossibly vulnerable afterward. Everyone listens unconsciously. The younger child breathing, the crackle of fire, the distant crunch of boots outside in deep snow. A surviving account from a winter trapping expedition described men becoming disoriented in extreme cold after only short periods outdoors at night. Fingers numbed rapidly. Breathing hurt. Even simple tasks grew exhausting beneath freezing air. The father returns moments later carrying an armful of split logs dusted with glittering frost. Ice clings thickly to his beard and eyelashes now. "You feel that?" Elias asks quietly. The father nods once. Sky cleared. That explains everything. Open skies, falling temperatures, a long frozen night still ahead. The cabin settles into uneasy wakefulness afterward. Nobody truly returns to sleep. Instead, people drift between half-dreams and listening. The mother hums softly beneath her breath, while rocking the younger child closer beside the fire. Ruth wraps extra cloth around her damaged fingers. Elias stares toward the ceiling beams while rubbing warmth back into his hands. The older child eventually falls asleep sitting upright beneath blankets near the dog. The fire continues burning steadily now, yet beyond its reach the cabin corners remain locked in darkness and cold. You realize something unsettling then. Frontier people rarely expected comfort during winter. What they hoped for instead was simply enough warmth, enough food, enough strength, enough luck reaching spring alive. Outside, the frozen wilderness stretches silently beneath moonlight, and snow drifts hard as stone. Inside the cabin, tired people gather as close as possible around one stubborn fire, while the longest cold of the season settles over the settlement like a second night wrapped inside the first. The silence feels wrong at first. You wake expecting wind. Days of storms trained your ears to constant noise, rattling shutters, groaning roof beams, snow brushing the walls through endless darkness. But this morning there is nothing. No wind, no snowfall, only stillness. The cabin remains dim beneath pale morning light filtering weakly through frost-coated windows. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, while everyone else still sleeps tangled beneath blankets and coats. For several moments you simply listen, and hear almost nothing at all. The father notices too when he wakes shortly afterward. He sits upright immediately, staring toward the windows with narrowed eyes. Storms past. Elias murmurs sleepily from near the wall. Maybe. Yet the silence afterward feels stranger than the storm itself. The father rises slowly and crosses toward the door while the dog watches with suspicious attention. Frost crunches faintly beneath the boots as he unlatches the heavy wooden bar. The door opens. Cold air spills inward, carrying dazzling white light. Outside, the world has disappeared beneath snow. Not metaphorically, actually disappeared. Drifts stand nearly waist-high against the cabin walls while the surrounding settlement lies buried under smooth, shining layers of untouched snow. Trees bend beneath enormous white weight. Fences vanish almost entirely beneath frozen waves, and above everything stretches a clear, pale blue sky so sharp and bright it almost hurts your eyes after days trapped indoors. The younger child coughs weakly beneath blankets, but seems cooler now. The mother checks his forehead immediately while the older child scrambles toward the doorway for a better look outside. "Can't even see the creek," he whispers. "You cannot." The entire valley appears transformed into one endless frozen surface, broken only by chimneys and dark pine tops emerging through the snow. A pattern found in many frontier accounts describes the eerie calm following major snowstorms. Travellers often wrote about sound behaving differently afterward because deep snow absorbed noise across the landscape, leaving settlements unnaturally quiet. Even the dog seems confused by it. He steps cautiously outside, sniffs the freezing air, then immediately sinks chest-deep into a drift with visible personal offence. Honestly, fair reaction. The father squints across the settlement. More cabins become visible now beneath rising chimney smoke. Tiny figures move slowly between buried structures carrying shovels and firewood. Everyone emerges cautiously after confinement, like survivors crawling from underground shelters. The mother wraps another blanket around the younger child while allowing him closer to the doorway for fresh air. The cabin itself feels brighter this morning too. Sunlight reflects fiercely from the snow outside, filling the room with pale silver light instead of the usual orange gloom from fire and candles. You notice how dirty everything suddenly appears. Smoke-stained beams, ash scattered near the hearth, wet boots, patches on blankets. Winter survival looked more romantic during storms when darkness hid details. One traveller crossing Colonial, Pennsylvania during a severe winter wrote that snow after storms resembled a second daylight upon the earth, because reflected sunlight made entire valleys glow. The father begins shoveling immediately after breakfast. No celebration regarding clear skies, just work. The drifts surrounding the cabin must be cleared before another storm arrives. Paths need reopening between the shed, woodpile, and neighbouring homes. Roofs require checking again under full daylight. Frontier winters rewarded optimism only after chores finished. You follow him outside into the freezing brightness. The cold feels different today, sharper perhaps, cleaner. Every breath stings your lungs while snow squeaks loudly beneath boots. Sunlight flashes painfully across untouched drifts stretching through the valley. The settlement looks smaller now against the massive white landscape surrounding it. Tiny cabins, thin smoke trails. Human survival reduced almost to a suggestion beneath winter. Several historical descriptions from northern colonies mention settlers becoming temporarily snowblind after storms due to sunlight reflecting intensely off fresh drifts. Some travellers improvised crude eye coverings with narrow slits cut into fabric or leather. Humanity discovering sunglasses through suffering once again. The father starts digging toward the woodpile first. Snow crashes heavily aside with each shovel stroke while ice crystals glitter through the air. Soon other sounds gradually return across the settlement. Axes chopping wood, voices calling between cabins, dogs barking distantly, the slow groan of packed snow sliding from rooftops, life waking carefully after burial. Elias helps clear paths despite obvious exhaustion from travel. Ruth remains indoors beside the younger child, whose fever finally seems easing slightly beneath blankets near the fire. The mother visibly relaxes for the first time in days. Not completely, just enough noticing. The older child climbs halfway onto a drift near the cabin before sinking suddenly to his waist and requiring dramatic rescue assistance. He laughs afterward anyway. Children recover quickly from fear once sunlight returns. A curious note preserved from one colonial settlement claimed people sometimes held informal snowshoe races after major storms, simply because communities became desperate for amusement during long winters. Frontier entertainment standards understandably shifted under several feet of snow. By midday, narrow pathways reappear gradually between cabins. The settlement begins resembling human habitation again rather than archaeological ruins buried beneath ice. Smoke rises steadily upward into the still blue sky. Women shake blankets near doorways. Men repair collapsed fences and clear buried sheds. Somewhere farther downhill, someone plays a fiddle badly enough that even the crows probably object. And through it all remains that strange winter silence beneath the noise. Snow absorbs sound endlessly. Even conversation seems softer. The father eventually pauses beside the cleared doorway and surveys the valley quietly. "Won't stay clear long," he mutters. Perhaps not. But today at least the sky shines bright above the frozen wilderness. The roof still stands. The fire still burns. The younger child sleeps more peacefully beside the hearth. And after endless nights of wind and darkness, the settlement breathes again beneath cold winter sunlight glittering across untouched snow. The digging begins before sunrise, not because anyone feels energetic, simply because the snow will not move itself, which honestly feels like poor teamwork from the landscape. You wake to the steady scrape of shovels outside the cabin and the dull thud of packed snow being thrown aside. Pale blue morning light filters through the frosted windows while smoke drifts lazily upward from the hearth. The fire survived the night well for once. That alone improves everyone's mood slightly. The younger child still coughs occasionally, but his fever seems lower this morning. He even asks quietly for breakfast, which the mother treats as excellent news despite the request involving little more than thin porridge and stale bread warmed beside the fire. The cabin smells less medicinal today, more like ordinary winter again. Smoke, wet wool, boiling oats, human exhaustion. Outside. The settlement has transformed into a construction site made entirely from snow. Narrow trenches now cut between cabins, where people spent yesterday reopening paths. Yet overnight, drifting already softened some of those roots again beneath glittering powder. Winter never accepts defeat permanently. The father hands you a second shovel after breakfast. "Need reaching the shed proper," he says. You step outside into freezing morning air sharp enough making your teeth ache. Snow squeaks beneath boots while sunlight flashes across endless white drifts surrounding the settlement. The cleared pathway from the cabin resembles a tiny canyon now, with walls of packed snow rising waist-high on either side. Children probably dreamed of playing here. Adults probably dreamed of spring. Several records from colonial frontier communities describe snowdrifts growing tall enough to bury fences completely during severe winters. Settlers sometimes navigated between buildings through carved pathways resembling tunnels after repeated storms. The father leads you toward the animal shed carrying an axe over one shoulder. Elias follows behind, hauling a wooden sled improvised from rough boards and rope. Every step requires effort. Snow remains deep beyond the packed pathways. Occasionally one leg punches unexpectedly through hidden, softer drifts nearly to the knee. The cold air burns your lungs while sunlight reflects painfully off the frozen landscape. And still the work continues. The shed appears half swallowed by snow despite earlier clearing efforts. Only the upper roofline and doorway remain fully visible now. The father begins chopping packed ice away from the entrance, while Elias shovels drifting snow onto the sled for hauling farther downhill. You join them, scrape, lift, throw, repeat endlessly. A practical challenge faced by many colonial settlements involved simply moving through winter terrain efficiently. Deep snow slowed travel dramatically, exhausted animals, buried supplies, and isolated homes from one another for long stretches of time. Inside the shed, the goats stare outward with deep suspicion toward humanity's management of weather conditions. Chickens huddle miserably near feed sacks while frost clings thickly to the inner walls. The father checks feed supplies carefully, Not much remains. You notice his expression tightening slightly. Outside again. Other settlement sounds drift faintly through the frozen air. Axes, voices, someone hammering wood somewhere uphill. The entire community spends these rare, clear days repairing damage and reclaiming buried spaces before the next storm arrives, because everyone knows another storm always arrives eventually. A particularly odd account from one northern settlement claimed people occasionally lost track of smaller tools entirely after dropping them into deep snow. Come spring thaw, axes, spoons, gloves, and even chickens reportedly reappeared across muddy fields like strange gifts returned by winter. The older child appears carrying a bucket nearly half his size through the narrow snow trench between cabins. He moves carefully, concentrating so intensely you briefly fear he might accidentally spill himself instead. The father takes the bucket gently. Pump froze some. Did you clear the top? Yes, the father nods once. Approval earned. Children on the frontier worked early because survival demanded extra hands constantly. Water hauling, wood gathering, animal feeding, mending, cooking assistance, and snow clearing often became part of childhood long before modern societies would permit anyone near sharp tools or frozen wells. The morning passes slowly through labour. Your shoulders ache from lifting heavy snow repeatedly. Gloves grow damp despite the cold. Frost forms along scarves and coat collars, while breath clouds endlessly through the bright air. Yet there is strange satisfaction too. Visible progress. Pathways widening. Doors uncovered. The settlement emerging gradually from burial. At midday the mother brings hot broth outside in a kettle, wrapped carefully with cloth to preserve heat. Steam curls upward dramatically in the freezing air, while everyone gathers briefly beside the cabin. The broth tastes smoky and salty and wonderful. Even the dog receives a scrap of bread afterward, which he accepts with profound emotional gratitude. Nearby, Ruth sits outside for the first time since arriving, her injured hand wrapped tightly beneath fresh bandages. Sunlight catches frost crystals along her shawl, while she watches the settlement quietly, looks smaller every winter. She murmurs. The father snorts softly. Snow gets bigger. Fair point, honestly. A surviving description from a colonial traveller compared frontier settlements after heavy snowfall to ships frozen into a white sea. Looking around now at chimneys rising above endless drifts, the comparison feels strangely accurate. The afternoon brings more digging, toward the wood pile, toward buried fencing, toward the well. Every task requires first finding the thing hidden beneath snow before beginning actual work on it. The older child accidentally drops a mitten into a drift and spends nearly 10 frantic minutes searching before the dog locates it immediately by sitting directly on top of it. Frontier dogs remain both co-workers and critics, apparently. By evening, the settlement finally shows signs of shape again beneath the snow. Narrow paths connect homes. Shed doors open properly. Smoke rises steadily into fading orange light as sunset spreads across the frozen valley. You return inside the cabin exhausted to the bone. The warmth feels deeper tonight after our outdoors. Firelight flickers softly across familiar walls, while the younger child sleeps more peacefully near the hearth. The mother stirs stew beside the fire. Elias rubs aching shoulders near the doorway. Outside, winter still covers everything. But for one hard-working day at least. The people inside this tiny settlement have pushed back against the snow and reclaimed a little piece of the buried world around them. The loneliness settles gradually. Not all at once. That would almost be easier. Instead, it arrives quietly over many winter days until you suddenly notice how small the world has become. Cabin, shed, woodpile, pathways through snow, the same few faces beside the same fire every evening while endless white wilderness surrounds the settlement in every direction. Tonight the cabin feels especially still. The younger child sleeps peacefully at last near the hearth, his fever mostly broken. Ruth quietly mends one of Elias's gloves beside candlelight, while the mother stirs a pot of thin stew over the fire. Outside, snow reflects pale moonlight across the buried valley. No storms tonight, no visitors, no dramatic events, only winter continuing, and somehow that feels heavier. The father sits near the doorway, carving slowly at a piece of wood while staring occasionally toward the frosted windows. The older child draws shapes into ash near the hearth using a stick. Nobody speaks for a while. The silence itself feels tired. Many surviving frontier letters describe winter isolation as emotionally exhausting, even when supplies remained stable and storms eased. Settlers missed neighbours, churches, markets, conversation, movement, and simple variety after weeks confined to small cabins surrounded by snow. You begin understanding why. Every day starts resembling the last. Wake, feed fire, carry wood, melt snow, repair clothing, check animals, sleep. Repeat until spring or madness arrives first, possibly both. The mother eventually breaks the silence quietly. I used to hear bells in winter. Everyone looks toward her. Bells back east. She smiles faintly without lifting her eyes from the pot. Church bells through the snow. The room falls quiet again afterward. You realize most people here left somewhere else behind. Towns, roads, families, noise. A curious account from one colonial settlement claimed some isolated families celebrated hearing distant wagon wheels during winter, as if witnessing a festival. After enough silence, even ordinary sounds became events worth remembering. Elias stretches stiff shoulders beside the wall. "Mis markets myself," he mutters, mishearing folk argue over nonsense. The father snorts softly. "We got nonsense here. Not enough variety." Even the mother laughs quietly at that. The fire pops sharply, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the dark rafters. Shadows flicker across the low ceiling while smoke drifts lazily through the warmest part of the room. You notice everyone staying closer together tonight without consciously deciding to. Loneliness works strangely during frontier winters. People craved solitude during crowded evenings, yet feared isolation once silence truly arrived. The older child asks suddenly, "How long till spring?" Nobody answers immediately, not because they do not know, because nobody trusts the answer. Some historical records from northern colonies mention late snowfall still arriving well into April or even May. Winter on the frontier rarely followed polite seasonal schedules. The father finally shrugs. Long enough. The older child sighs dramatically and returns to drawing shapes in the ash. Reasonable response, honestly. Ruth finishes mending the glove before folding her hands quietly in her lap. Firelight catches the healing skin along her frost-bitten fingers. She stares toward the flames with distant eyes. "First winter after my husband died," she says softly. "I near forgot how to speak proper. Nobody interrupts. Went weeks hearing no voice but my own." The cabin feels smaller afterward. Not uncomfortable, just close. The kind of closeness where people begin revealing thoughts they would normally leave hidden. Accounts preserved from widows and isolated settlers often describe winter silence, affecting the mind in surprising ways. Some people talk to animals constantly. Others read the same Bible passages aloud repeatedly just to hear another voice inside the room. The father nods slowly toward Ruth. "I talked to the goats once during a storm." The mother raises an eyebrow. "Once." A rare grin appears beneath his beard. The room warms slightly from the laughter that follows. Even the younger child wakes briefly, smiling sleepily before drifting back beneath blankets. A particularly odd frontier habit involved naming tools during long winters. Several diaries mention axes, rifles, or sleds receiving nicknames after months of isolation. Historians examining those accounts still debate whether this reflected humour, boredom, or people slowly losing reasonable emotional boundaries with farm equipment. Honestly, after enough snowstorms, the shovel probably starts feeling like family anyway. Outside, moonlight glows softly across buried pathways between cabins. The settlement seems peaceful now, almost beautiful. Yet beauty and hardship often occupy the same space out here. The mother ladles stew into bowls while everyone shifts closer toward the fire again. Supper passes quietly beneath low conversation and the steady sound of crackling logs. No stories tonight. Nobody seems to have energy for them. Instead, people sit together in comfortable silence while candlelight flickers gently across tired faces. The father eventually rises and checks the door latch for perhaps the 5th time this evening. Habit more than necessity. The older child curls beside the dog near the hearth. Ruth leans sleepily against the wall wrapped beneath patched blankets, and slowly the cabin settles deeper into another long winter night. You realize something then. The settlement survives not simply through firewood or food or sturdy roofs. It survives because people remain together, because someone notices when a child coughs, because travelers share herbs, because neighbors dig paths after storms, because even silence becomes easier carrying alongside others. Outside, the frozen wilderness stretches endlessly beneath pale moonlight and snow. Inside the tiny cabin, warmth gathers softly around exhausted bodies, while loneliness waits patiently beyond the walls like another form of winter trying to find its way inside. Christmas morning arrives quietly beneath falling snow, not a blizzard this time. Just soft, steady flakes drifting through pale grey light beyond the frosted windows. You wake to unfamiliar smells moving gently through the cabin air. Something sweeter than ordinary stew or boiled oats. The scent drifts warmly above the usual smoke and damp wool. The younger child notices first. Apples, he whispers from beneath blankets near the hearth. The mother smiles without turning from the fire. A tiny iron pan sits above the flames where slices of dried apples simmer slowly with a little honey and cornmeal. Not much. Just enough filling the room with sweetness, rare enough feeling almost magical after months of salted meat and winter broth. The older child sits upright immediately. The dog does too, though likely for less spiritual reasons. In many colonial settlements, winter holidays remained modest affairs shaped heavily by weather, religion, and available food supplies. Frontier families rarely celebrated with lavish feasts unless harvest stores had been especially successful. Still, people found ways marking the season, even here, especially here perhaps. The father enters carrying fresh firewood dusted with snow. Cold air swirls briefly through the cabin before the door shuts again. "Snow's light," he says. The mother nods. "Good enough." That phrase seems to define frontier holidays perfectly. Good enough warmth, good enough food, good enough peace for one winter day. Ruth helps arrange rough wooden bowls along the table, while Elias produces a tiny cloth bundle from inside his coat with surprising ceremony. Coffee beans, very few, but real. The older child gasps softly as though witnessing buried treasure uncovered beneath the snow. Honestly, not entirely inaccurate. One preserved account from a colonial household described families saving tiny luxury items specifically for winter holidays. Sugar, dried fruit, imported tea, cinnamon. Or coffee might remain hidden away for months until special occasions finally justified opening them. The father takes the bundle carefully. Thought you traders drank all this southward. Thought about it. The room laughs softly. Even the younger child manages a weak smile beneath blankets near the fire. His fever has mostly faded now, leaving only exhaustion and occasional coughing behind. The mother grinds the precious beans slowly using a small hand mill near the hearth. The smell spreads through the cabin almost immediately. Rich, warm, bitter in the best possible way. You realize nobody here expects abundance anymore. Small comforts have become enormous luxuries after weeks of storms and cold. Outside, snow drifts lazily downward across buried pathways between cabins. Smoke rises from neighbouring chimneys into the pale morning sky. Somewhere faintly downhill you hear distant singing carried softly through the frozen air. Church hymns, perhaps, or simply neighbours refusing silence today. A curious custom from certain colonial communities involved placing evergreen branches inside homes during winter holidays because green plants symbolise life surviving through darkness and cold. Frontier families often improvise decorations using pine, holly, berries, or carved wooden ornaments. The older child points excitedly toward the doorway where the father now hangs a small pine branch tied with faded red cloth. "Looks crooked," Elias says. "It's a branch," the father replies. Fair point, honestly. Breakfast lasts longer than usual today. Nobody rushes. The apple mixture disappears slowly from bowls while coffee warms stiff hands beside the fire. Even the dog receives an extra scrap of bread, which he accepts with immediate emotional devotion toward the holiday spirit. The cabin feels different this morning. Still crowded, still smoky, still cold near the walls, yet softer somehow. You notice everyone speaking more gently, laughing easier. The father even allows the older child sitting briefly in his chair beside the hearth, which apparently qualifies as frontier luxury seating. Several historical writings suggest holidays during harsh winters often carried intense emotional importance, precisely because daily life remained so difficult. Celebrations broke routine and reminded isolated communities that time continued moving forward despite storms and darkness. The mother eventually opens a small wooden box hidden carefully near the back wall. Inside rests a single candle made from beeswax instead of ordinary tallow. Golden, smooth, almost elegant. She lights it quietly beside the hearth. The flame burns cleaner and brighter than the others. The older child stares at it with awe. One traveller visiting colonial settlements remarked that beeswax candles smelled almost heavenly compared to common tallow versions, which frequently filled homes with greasy smoke and unpleasant odours, considering the cabin usually smells like wet boots arguing with pine smoke. The improvement feels significant. Snow continues falling softly through the afternoon. Not enough trapping anyone indoors completely, just enough wrapping the valley in peaceful silence. Elias eventually pulls out a small fiddle from among his belongings. The instrument looks weathered and slightly warped from travel. But when he begins playing quietly beside the fire, the cabin transforms completely. The music feels fragile, thin at first, then warmer. The younger child drifts asleep, smiling beneath blankets, while the older boy taps his feet softly against the floorboards. Ruth hums along under her breath while sewing near the candlelight. The father closes his eyes, briefly listening. You suspect music sounded different during winters like this, more necessary somehow. One particularly charming detail from old frontier journals describes settlers clearing cabin floors for dancing during winter celebrations, even when snowstorms raged outside. Families squeezed between tables, dogs, chairs, and drying laundry simply because joy itself became survival too. Nobody dances tonight. Everyone feels too tired for that. Still, the fiddle continues softly beside the fire while snow falls beyond the windows and warm coffee scents linger through the cabin air. And for a few peaceful hours in the middle of endless winter, the tiny colonial cabin no longer feels like a fragile shelter trapped against the wilderness. It feels like home. The wolves begin visiting after the cold deepens again, not openly at first, just tracks. You discover them one morning beyond the tree line where snow remains untouched beside the settlement. Large prints crossing the frozen surface in long deliberate patterns before disappearing back into the pines. The father crouches beside them silently, fresh. The dog notices immediately too. His fur rises along the neck while he sniffs the frozen air with sudden intense focus. The older child whispers, "Big ones." The father nods once. "Hungry ones." That answer feels enough. Predators often moved closer to settlements during severe winters when deep snow and scarce prey made hunting difficult. Livestock, scraps, and weakened animals attracted wolves, foxes, and other scavengers toward frontier communities struggling through harsh seasons themselves. The settlement changes slightly afterward. Doors close faster. Children stay nearer the cabins. The father checks the musket more frequently. Outside, snow lies hard and glittering beneath pale winter sunlight. The storms have paused for several days now, leaving the valley wrapped in deep, frozen stillness once again. Even sound feels cautious. The younger child has recovered enough helping with small chores beside the hearth. His cough lingers occasionally, but strength slowly returns to his face. Today he sits near the fire carving awkward shapes into a scrap of wood while Ruth guides his hands patiently. The mother hangs strips of dried meat higher from the rafters after hearing about the tracks. You notice nobody wastes food scraps outside anymore. A little-known detail from frontier settlements involves wolves sometimes growing remarkably bold during difficult winters. There are scattered reports of animals approaching cabins directly at night, especially when starvation drove them closer toward human activity. The father steps outside before dusk, carrying the musket over one shoulder. You follow him through the packed snow path circling behind the cabin. The air smells sharply of pine and frozen earth beneath the endless cold. Sunlight fades early this time of year. Long blue shadows already stretch across the valley while frost gathers along buried fences. Near the shed, the father stops suddenly. More tracks, closer now. The prints circle the outer edge of the animal pen before disappearing toward the woods again. The goats inside the shed seem restless tonight too. Animals always know first. A strange frontier belief claimed wolves avoided homes where iron hung above the doorway. Some settlers nailed horseshoes near cabin entrances not only for luck, but because they believed metal frightened wandering spirits and predators alike. Whether wolves respected decorative blacksmithing remains uncertain. The father studies the tracks quietly. 3, maybe 4. The dog growls low in his throat while staring toward the trees. You look too. The forest stands dark and still beneath layers of snow. Pine branches droop heavily under frost, while shadows gather thickly between trunks. Nothing moves, which somehow feels worse. Back inside the cabin. Evening settles slowly around the firelight. Elias cleans the musket carefully while the mother prepares supper beside the hearth. The older child asks endless questions about wolves until Ruth finally threatens assigning him outdoor watch duty personally. That quiets him for approximately 40 seconds. Dinner passes beneath uneasy conversation. Outside, darkness deepens quickly while the settlement disappears beneath the moonlight and shadow. The father bars the door earlier tonight. Not dramatically, just firmly. Historical observations from winter settlements often mention nighttime fear of predators increasing during difficult seasons. Though actual wolf attacks on humans remained relatively rare, livestock and exposed food sources posed easier targets. Still, hearing wolves beyond cabin walls after midnight probably inspired very little statistical comfort. The fire burns steadily while wind brushes softly through distant trees. Everyone stays awake longer than usual tonight. Even the younger child resists sleep while listening toward the windows every few minutes. Then it comes. A howl. Faint at first. Far away beyond the frozen creek. The cabin goes completely still. Another howl answers farther north, then silence again. The sound feels unlike anything else in winter. Not barking, not wind. Something deeper and older moving through the darkness between snow-covered trees. The dog stands immediately near the hearth with ears forward and body rigid. The older child whispers, "They're close." "Not too close," Elias says calmly, but he reaches for the musket anyway. One trader's journal from the colonial frontier described wolf howls during winter nights, sounding like the woods themselves crying out. Sitting here inside the tiny cabin while darkness presses beyond the walls, you understand the description perfectly. The younger child curls closer beneath blankets near the fire. The mother pulls him gently against her side while staring toward the windows. Outside, another howl rises briefly before fading into the frozen distance. The father opens the door only slightly to listen better. Cold air spills inward, carrying moonlight and the sharp scent of snow. For several moments nobody moves. Then the door closes again, still at the ridge. He says quietly. Relief spreads through the room, though nobody admits it aloud. The wolves continue occasionally through the night, distant calls drifting between forests and frozen hillsides while firelight flickers softly across the cabin walls. Eventually the older child falls asleep despite himself near the hearth. The younger boy soon follows, wrapped beneath heavy quilts beside the dog, who remains stubbornly awake, guarding the room with professional seriousness vastly exceeding his normal workplace attitude. The father stays awake longest, watching the fire, listening. Outside, the wilderness remains vast and frozen beneath moonlight and drifting frost, somewhere beyond the settlement. Lean grey shapes move silently through deep snow, searching for food beneath the endless winter sky, and inside the tiny colonial cabin. Warm light glows against the darkness while tired people sleep closer together than usual, comforted by fire, walls, and one another against the wildness waiting beyond the trees. The first sign of spring arrives as dripping water, not birds, not flowers, certainly not warmth, just dripping. You hear it one afternoon while sitting beside the hearth repairing a cracked lantern hook with Elias. At first the sound seems strange because winter trained everyone listening for wind. Coughing, or creaking roof beams. Drip. Pause. Drip again. The older child notices too. Water. The father glances toward the doorway and nods slowly. Outside. Pale sunlight spills across the snow-covered valley beneath softer grey clouds. The air remains cold enough, frosting your breath immediately. Yet something has changed during the past few days. The cold no longer bites quite as sharply. Snow along the cabin roof edges darkens and loosens beneath afternoon light. Tiny streams begin slipping downward in slow silver threads before freezing again overnight. The younger child, now fully recovered except for an occasional cough, presses his face eagerly near the window. It's melting. Barely. But yes. Several colonial diaries celebrate late winter thaws with almost emotional disbelief. After months trapped in frozen routines, even muddy pathways and dripping roofs began feeling miraculous. The cabin smells different lately too. Still smoke. Still wool, still damp leather drying near the fire. But now hints of wet earth drift occasionally through the doorway whenever someone steps outside. The settlement notices the change immediately. People linger outdoors longer during daylight. Conversations continue beside wood piles, instead of ending instantly in freezing wind. Children stomp slushy snow from boots while returning from the creek. Even the dog seems happier, though admittedly his emotional standards remain heavily influenced by food distribution. The father spends much of the afternoon inspecting roof edges and drainage around the cabin. Melting snow creates entirely new problems now. Water seeps through cracks, weakens foundations, and refreezes overnight into dangerous ice. Winter rarely leaves politely. One historical detail often overlooked involves how difficult late winter and early spring became for frontier settlements. Thawing conditions created mud, flooding, collapsing ice crossings, spoiled food stores, and outbreaks of illness once temperatures fluctuated unpredictably. The older child discovers a patch of exposed grass beside the shed and treats it like a sacred archaeological discovery. Look, everyone looks. It is approximately 3 blades of flattened brown grass surrounded by dirty snow. Yet the excitement feels completely genuine. Ruth laughs softly from beside the doorway while flexing her healing hand in the sunlight. "Whole valley turning green already," Elias says dryly. "By summer, perhaps," the father replies. A peculiar custom mentioned in a few rural settlements involved people predicting the coming spring by observing which side of trees lost snow first. South-facing trunks often thawed earlier, leading some families treating exposed bark like tiny seasonal calendars. Honestly, after months of snowstorms, you probably would celebrate thawing tree bark too. The creek begins changing next. You hear it before seeing it, water moving beneath ice, a low rushing sound hidden under frozen surfaces beyond the settlement. The father takes you there near sunset while carrying an axe over one shoulder. Snow still blankets most of the valley, but narrow patches of darker earth now appear near rocks and tree roots where sunlight gathers strongest. The creek looks trapped between seasons. Ice still covers much of it, thick and pale beneath drifting snow, yet underneath. Dark water pushes steadily onward. Cracks spread slowly through the frozen surface while thin currents swirl beneath. One traveller crossing Colonial territory in early spring described rivers sounding restless beneath their winter chains. Standing here, listening to hidden water moving under ice, the phrase feels strangely perfect. The father watches the creek carefully. Dangerous now, he says. Melting ice created serious hazards during seasonal thaws. Frozen rivers that supported sleds and travellers weeks earlier suddenly weakened unpredictably beneath warmer temperatures. The dog edges cautiously toward the creek before the father calls him sharply back. Even he understands. Back at the cabin. The mother hangs blankets outdoors briefly for fresh air while sunlight still remains. Steam rises faintly from damp fabric beneath the pale afternoon sky. The cabin interior grows muddy more often now. Snow tracked indoors melts rapidly near the hearth, leaving wet footprints and slippery floorboards behind. Winter's clean white surface slowly transforms into slush and dripping chaos. A frontier woman once complained in a letter that late winter smelled like wet boots and disappointment. Looking around the cabin today, you suspect she spoke from deep personal experience. Still, moods improve noticeably. The older child spends evenings asking about planting season again. Elias discusses travelling south once roads reopen properly. Ruth speaks more about returning home rather than merely surviving winter. Even the father smiles occasionally now when watching water drip steadily from the roof. Not often, but enough noticing. The wolves disappear too. Their tracks no longer circle near the tree line each morning, somewhere deeper in the forests. Prey has likely begun moving again beneath thinning snow. At dusk, the settlement glows softly beneath fading gold light. Chimney smoke rises into gentler skies while patches of exposed earth darken the pathways between cabins. The snow remains deep. Winter still surrounds everything. Yet beneath the frozen surface, movement has returned to the world. Water flows, ice cracks, mud appears, and inside the tiny colonial cabin, people begin speaking about tomorrow again instead of merely enduring today. Spring arrives slowly across the valley, not with dramatic transformation, not with sudden warmth or fields bursting green overnight. Instead, the wilderness loosens winter's grip one careful inch at a time. Snow retreats first from the darker places beneath pine trees. Mud appears along pathways between cabins where drifts once stood shoulder high. The creek finally breaks open completely, carrying shattered ice downstream in slow, grinding sheets that echo through the valley at night. And inside the tiny cabin, windows remain open a little longer each day. Fresh air moves through the room, now carrying scents absent for months. Wet earth, pine sap, cold running water. The smoke still lingers in the rafters, but spring slowly pushes against it. The father stands outside one morning studying the softened ground near the edge of the settlement, while birds move restlessly through branches overhead. Actual birds, not ravens waiting patiently for frontier mistakes. Small, ordinary birds returning north. The older child notices them first and immediately announces this discovery with the emotional intensity usually reserved for royal coronations. The younger child runs outside afterward without coughing for the first time in weeks. That alone feels like spring. Many colonial families viewed the end of winter less as celebration and more as relief. Surviving harsh seasons required enormous labour, luck, cooperation, and endurance. When thaw finally arrived, people often focused immediately on planting, repairing, rebuilding, and preparing for the next cycle. Because frontier life never paused long enough for victory speeches, Ruth and Elias prepare leaving soon now that roads begin reopening southward. Their horses regain strength beneath longer days and better weather. The father helps repair part of the saddle, while Ruth folds blankets carefully beside the doorway. The cabin feels different already, knowing departure approaches. Less crowded, perhaps, but also quieter in advance. A weathered travel diary from the colonial frontier once described spring roads as oceans of mud pretending to be pathways. Looking outside now at the thick brown slush swallowing boots beside the settlement, the description feels deeply accurate. The dog hates the mud passionately. Every trip outdoors becomes personal betrayal. You sit outside beside the cabin one evening while pale golden sunlight spreads across the valley. Snow still clings stubbornly to shaded hillsides farther north, but the settlement itself has begun changing colour. Brown earth, dark wood, hints of green. The father lowers himself beside you, carrying 2 rough wooden cups filled with weak cider saved carefully through winter. Neither of you speaks immediately. There's enough sound already. Water running through the creek, birds moving through branches, axes chopping somewhere downhill, the quiet murmur of people rebuilding fences and clearing debris left behind after months of storms, life returning. One small but charming detail preserved in several colonial letters mentions how intensely people appreciated simple outdoor sounds after winter isolation. Flowing water, frogs, birdsong, even buzzing insects reportedly felt almost overwhelming after endless weeks of wind and silence. The father studies the valley quietly. "Hard winter," he says finally. You nod. Yet looking around now, signs of survival appear everywhere. Smoke still rises from chimneys. Children run through muddy pathways. Goats complain loudly from the shed with renewed confidence. The cabin still stands beneath patched roofing and smoke-darkened beams. A peculiar frontier superstition claimed the first bird heard during spring predicted the coming year. Hearing robins supposedly promised good fortune. Hearing crows first apparently suggested trouble ahead. Which feels slightly unfair toward crows, honestly. The mother hangs blankets outdoors beside the cabin where sunlight catches them softly in the breeze. The younger child helps gather sticks near the creek, while the older boy attempts constructing something ambitious and structurally concerning from leftover fence pieces. Elias eventually joins you outside carrying his fiddle. Without ceremony, he begins playing quietly while sunset spreads warm gold across melting snowfields. The music sounds different outdoors, lighter somehow, no longer trapped inside smoky walls beside endless firelight. The valley itself seems to breathe easier now. A few lingering patches of snow slide from distant roofs with soft collapsing sounds, while evening shadows stretch slowly across the muddy settlement. The cabin behind you glows warmly through open windows. You remember how it looked during the first storm. Small, dark, fragile beneath endless snow and wilderness. And perhaps it truly was fragile, but it endured. So did the people inside it. Through smoke-filled nights and sagging roofs, through coughing children and dwindling supplies, through loneliness, wolves, frozen mornings, and endless storms pressing against the walls, the fire kept burning, hands kept working, voices kept speaking softly through the dark, and now spring light reaches through the windows once more. The sky deepens gradually toward evening blue while colder air settles gently over the valley again. Not winter cold this time, just nighttime, ordinary nighttime. the kind that no longer feels threatening. The fiddle continues softly nearby. The creek flows steadily through melting ice, and the tiny colonial cabin rests quietly beside the trees, no longer trapped beneath endless snowstorms, but carrying every memory of winter within its smoke-stained walls. Now the evening grows softer. The light fades slowly from the windows while the last gold colours disappear across the hills. You can hear the gentle crackle of the hearth inside the cabin, and the quiet murmur of tired voices settling into another peaceful night. The air smells of damp earth and pine sap now instead of only smoke and frost. Somewhere near the creek, frogs begin calling softly through the darkness while water moves steadily over loosened stones. You breathe deeply. The winter is finally ending. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for muddy paths and open windows. Enough for birds returning to branches above the settlement. Enough for children running outside without fear of storms swallowing the world by nightfall. The cabin still stands warm against the evening air. Firelight flickers gently through the windows while blankets sway softly on the drying line nearby. And as the valley settles into quiet spring darkness, you feel the long, hard season drifting farther behind like snow, melting slowly into the earth. The fire burns low, voices soften, the creek keeps flowing through the night, and at last, after endless storms and frozen mornings, the wilderness itself seems finally ready to sleep. Sweet dreams,